She walked into the church in a white wedding dress concealing her scars, and the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle was the heir to the family that had created them. Kael Virelli didn't know that, but on their wedding night, when he inadvertently saw Seraphine's back, the burns, the knife wounds, and a symbol etched into her flesh as a mark of ownership, his world crumbled. Because that symbol wasn't that of an enemy, it was the emblem of his own bloodline. This is the story of a marriage built on blood and bone, and two people who must choose between family and truth. Watch until the end. Like and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. The rain came down like it had somewhere to be. It hammered the cobblestones of Blackwater City in curtains so thick you could barely see the line of black vehicles rolling through the old cathedral district, their headlights cutting pale tunnels through the downpour. Armored SUVs mostly. A few vintage sedans that cost more than most men earned in a decade. The convoy moved slowly, the way powerful things always move, without urgency, because the world arranges itself around them. On both sides of the street, men stood beneath the awnings of shuttered shops and in doorways that smelled of mildew and old stone. They weren't waiting for a bus. They weren't seeking shelter from the rain. They wore dark clothing and kept their hands visible and still, and their eyes tracked the convoy with the flat professional attention of men who got paid to notice things that didn't fit. 3 blocks north, 2 snipers had been on their rooftop positions since 4 in the morning. The radio frequency reserved for the evening had been cleared of all civilian chatter by a man whose name appeared nowhere on any official document. Blackwater City had not seen a wedding like this in 15 years. It had not needed to. Inside the lead vehicle, Kael Virelli sat with his jacket unbuttoned and his tie loosened, and his jaw set in a way that made his driver keep his eyes carefully forward. Kael was 31 years old and looked older in the way that men look older when they've spent years carrying weight that wasn't distributed evenly. His face was angular, not unhandsome, with a thin scar that crossed through his left eyebrow from a disagreement that had happened when he was 19 in which the other party had not survived. His hands rested on his knees with the deliberate stillness of someone who had trained himself not to fidget, because fidgeting communicated uncertainty, and uncertainty was a luxury the Virelli name could not afford. His best man, a thick-necked man named Dorian, who had been with Kael since they were teenagers running messages through the harbor district, glanced at him from the passenger seat. "You doing all right?" "Don't ask me that again tonight," Kael said. Dorian nodded and turned back to watching the rain. The cathedral ahead had been beautiful once. The architecture still carried the memory of that beauty. The soaring stone facade, the twin bell towers blackened by decades of city air, the narrow windows of colored glass that threw fractured light across the interior even on cloudy days. But the glass on the eastern tower was patched in 2 places with plywood, where old gunfire had found it during the street battles of 15 years ago, and no one had ever replaced those panes. It was the kind of detail that other cities would have fixed. Blackwater City left it. A reminder. You didn't forget the war here, you kept it visible. 15 years of war between the Virelli Syndicate and the Vale Organization had done things to the city that couldn't be measured in body counts alone. It had hollowed out neighborhoods, turned entire blocks into dead zones where even the stray cats stopped going, corrupted police precincts and city council chambers and judges' chambers, until the legitimate infrastructure of Blackwater was so riddled with criminal influence that it was impossible to tell where the city ended and the syndicates began. Over 300 men had died in those 15 years. Dozens of civilians caught in the wrong place. 2 federal agents whose names were still spoken carefully in certain circles. It had started with a single murder, the way these things always do. Marco Virelli, Kael's older brother, 26 years old, quiet and careful, and the only person in the family who had ever made Kael laugh without effort, had been shot 3 times in the parking garage beneath the Virelli accounting offices on a Tuesday afternoon in October. 3 bullets. Clean, professional, deliberate. His killers had never been formally identified, though the Virelli family had their certainty about who gave the order, the Vales. And so the war. Now, 15 years later, with the bodies piled high and both families bled down to their cores, a treaty had been negotiated by men who were exhausted and pragmatic and frightened by the federal attention that had lately begun accumulating around Blackwater City like storm clouds. The terms were elaborate, and carefully balanced and involved financial concessions and territorial agreements and sworn statements that would never be admissible in any court because they didn't technically exist. And at the center of it all, like a pin holding two pieces of fabric together, was a marriage. Kael Varelli to Seraphine Vale, the only surviving child of Dominic Vale. Kael had agreed to it the same way he agreed to most things that he didn't want to do, by convincing himself that it was purely tactical and that his personal feelings on the subject were irrelevant. He had met Seraphine Vale exactly twice before tonight. Once at a neutral meeting in a hotel conference room where lawyers and family representatives had ironed out the basic framework of the treaty, and once at a brief formal dinner 6 weeks later that lasted 40 minutes and involved almost no direct conversation between the two of them. She had sat across the table from him and eaten her food with careful precision and answered the questions directed at her by the lawyers in short, complete sentences that gave away nothing. He had no particular read on her, which itself struck him as unusual. He was good at reading people. It was one of the skills that had kept him alive in a profession where misreading someone's intentions could get you buried in a concrete pier. She had given him nothing to read. He'd filed that away and moved on. The convoy stopped at the cathedral steps. Dorian stepped out first, scanned the perimeter with the casual efficiency of long practice, and opened Kael's door. The rain hit Kael's face cold and immediate, and he tilted his head up for a moment and let it, which was the closest he'd come all day to anything that felt like honesty. Then he straightened his tie, buttoned his jacket, and walked up the cathedral steps with the particular stride of a man who has decided to do something and will not be seen hesitating about it. Inside, the cathedral smelled of old stone and candle wax, and the particular institutional cleanliness of a space that had been thoroughly scrubbed in preparation for an event that would be attended by men who noticed when things weren't clean. The pews on both sides were filled with a combination of suited figures who represented the two families and their affiliated organizations, and the tension between the two halves of the congregation was a physical thing, like the charge in the air before lightning. The Varelli side sat rigid and formal. The Vale contingent across the aisle was quieter in a way that wasn't peace. It was watchfulness. At the front, an officiant who had been paid enough to make this legal and ask no questions waited with the practiced neutrality of a man who had married 3 mob bosses in his career and understood that his professional value lay entirely in his discretion. Kyle took his position at the altar and stared at the doors at the far end of the cathedral. He waited. The doors opened, and Seraphine Vale came through them. She wore ivory silk that caught the candlelight and moved with the slow deliberateness of a woman who had rehearsed every step. Her dark hair was pulled back, severe, which made her face very clear and very still. She carried no flowers. Her left hand rested lightly on the arm of her father, Dominic Vale, a heavy man in his 60s with the kind of face that had once been intimidating and now just looked tired. He walked with a slight limp from an old wound and kept his eyes forward. Seraphine's eyes moved, though. Not wildly, not with the darting nervousness of a frightened woman. They moved with controlled deliberateness, cataloging the room in a specific sequence. First the exits, Kyle noticed, then the positions of unfamiliar faces, then the arrangement of the Vale contingent, and finally, only finally, Kyle himself. Their eyes met and held for 3 seconds. He found nothing in hers that he recognized. Not fear, not anger, not the particular brittle composure of a woman performing courage. Just a clear, measuring attention that reminded him incongruously of the way experienced soldiers looked at terrain. She reached the altar. Dominic Vale released her arm without ceremony and stepped aside. She stood beside Kyle and did not look at him again. The ceremony lasted 22 minutes. Kyle said the words he was supposed to say. Seraphine said hers in a voice that was quiet and perfectly steady. When the officiant directed him to take her hand, he did, and her hand was cold and dry and did not tremble at all. He placed the ring on her finger and she placed one on his, and neither of them looked at each other's faces when it happened, which he recognized as a particular form of mutual self-protection. At the moment when they were directed to seal the ceremony, Seraphine turned to face him with the controlled composure of a woman executing a task, and he kissed her once, briefly, and it tasted like nothing. The assembled families on both sides registered approval with the kind of restrained applause that powerful men produce when they're trying not to show relief. It was done. The reception was held at the Varelli estate, a sprawling compound on the northern edge of the city that backed against a private stretch of river and was protected by 3 layers of security that most government facilities would have envied. By the time the convoy arrived, the main hall had been prepared with the kind of excess that the Virelli family displayed on strategic occasions. Crystal glassware, fresh flowers that had been flown in at significant cost, a 6-piece ensemble that played at exactly the right volume to allow conversation while signaling that this was a formal event deserving of gravitas. KL moved through it with the efficiency of someone fulfilling obligations. He stood for photographs he wouldn't keep. He accepted congratulations from men whose names he knew and men whose names he was supposed to know. He drank 1 glass of whiskey and then switched to water, because he never drank at events where this many unknown variables were present, and tonight there were more unknown variables than he'd had in years. He was aware of Seraphine the entire time, not because he was watching her, because she kept doing things that were almost imperceptible and that he kept perceiving. The first thing was the flinching. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss unless you were specifically trained to notice micro-responses, which Kael was. When Tomas Bresch, one of the old guard Virelli captains, 60 years old, built like a retired bouncer, had been with the family since before Kael was born, made his way across the room to pay his respects, Seraphine's right hand tightened around the stem of her champagne glass at 22 steps distance. By the time Bresch was close enough to reach out and take her free hand and make the standard ceremonial noises about welcoming her to the family, her expression had been fully composed for several seconds. But the hand had tightened. Kael filed it. The second thing was the name. He was in conversation with Dorian and 2 of the Eastern District captains when one of the Vale family's lawyers, making genial small talk nearby, clearly trying to establish some cross-family goodwill, mentioned offhandedly that the night of the Ravenna Harbor incident had been when everything changed, hadn't it? And what a thing it was that they'd finally gotten past it. Seraphine was 12 feet away and had her back to the lawyer. She shouldn't have heard it over the ensemble and the ambient conversation of 100 people. Her shoulders changed, not dropped, not tensed. Changed, in a way that was more complicated than either of those things, like something inside them had shifted or withdrawn. She took a slow breath that he could identify only because he was watching her back and could see the movement. Then she turned and said something pleasant and unmemorable to the Vale family member beside her, and her face was completely smooth. Kael watched this and said nothing and filed it with the other thing. By midnight, the formal obligations of the evening were finished. The families had exchanged the ceremonial gestures that the treaty required. The lawyers had witnessed the things that needed witnessing. The correct photographs had been taken. The correct toasts had been made, each one carefully worded to honor the alliance without suggesting that either side was conceding anything to the other. The guests departed with the controlled efficiency of people who understood that events like this should end cleanly, and by 12:30 the estate was occupied only by Virelli household staff and a reduced security detail and the married couple who had not, since the ceremony, spoken a single private word to each other. A household member showed Seraphine to the rooms that had been prepared. Kael gave it 20 minutes before he followed. He knocked. "Come in." She was standing by the window with her back to the door, still in the ivory dress, looking out at the river that ran dark and rain-swollen beyond the estate grounds. The room was large and formal and had been set up with the particular impersonal elegance of a guest suite in a house that wasn't used to ordinary life. "I'm not here to—" he started. "I know," she said. "Sit down or stand. Whatever you want." He stood. "How are you?" "That's not a real question." He accepted that. "No, it isn't." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had lightened to something steadier, and the river beyond the glass had the dull pewter look of moving water at night. "There'll be a schedule tomorrow," he said. "Appearances. The family will expect—" "I understand what's expected." Her voice was flat, not hostile, simply factual. "I've understood it for some time." "All right." He should have left. That was the intelligent thing, the thing that preserved whatever minimal equilibrium they had managed to establish. He was tired, and there were decisions to be made in the morning, and the marriage had already served its essential purpose for tonight. It existed, it was legal, it had been witnessed by both families. He was 3 steps toward the door when his peripheral vision caught something. The dress had a low back. He hadn't registered it during the ceremony because she'd been facing him and then they'd been walking side by side. But she'd moved slightly, shifted her weight toward the window, and the angle between his position and the bedside lamp created a clear line of sight across her back. He stopped walking. She didn't know he'd stopped. She was still looking at the river. He stood completely still and looked at what was on her back. The scars were old. That was the first thing his mind processed. The texture and color of healed tissue rather than fresh injury. They crossed each other in patterns that suggested multiple distinct incidents rather than a single event. Along her right shoulder blade, the pale rippled topography of a burn mark, approximately the size of a man's palm. Lower, 3 parallel lines that had the deliberateness of blade work. On her left side, a series of smaller marks clustered together that he recognized, from contexts he would rather not have had occasion to know, as the kind left by ligature over a prolonged period. She had been bound, for long enough to leave permanent marks. His mind was moving very fast and very quietly in the way it did when he was trying to keep his face from showing anything. Then he saw the other thing, below her left shoulder blade. Small, faded with age, the way scar tissue fades over years, but still clear if you knew what you were looking for. And Kael knew exactly what he was looking for because he had grown up seeing it on family documents and signet rings and the old carved woodwork above the fireplace in his father's study. The Virelli crest, not a tattoo, not ink, carved into the skin of a woman who had been, when the geography of that old scar tissue was accounted for, very possibly a child when it was put there. The room was absolutely silent except for the rain against the glass and the distant sound of the river. Seraphine shifted slightly at the window, and the angle changed, and the lamp shadow fell differently, and the moment closed as if it had never happened. But he had seen it. He had seen it. "Good night," he said, and his voice came out level, which cost him something he couldn't quantify. She turned from the window and looked at him with that clear, measuring attention she'd deployed at the altar. "Good night," she said. He left the room and closed the door with deliberate quietness, and stood in the hallway for a long moment with his back against the wall and his hands at his sides and his eyes on the ceiling. He could hear his own heartbeat. Down the corridor, the night security detail made their rotation without noticing the heir of the Virelli syndicate, standing motionless in the dark outside his new wife's room, conducting a very rapid and very ugly accounting of everything he thought he knew about the 15-year war that had defined his entire adult life. He went to his study. He didn't sleep. By 3 in the morning, he had pulled every file he had access to on the Ravenna Harbor incident, which was the official designation for the night that had marked the first major escalation of violence between the Virelli and Vale organizations 3 years after Marco's death. The night the war stopped being a series of targeted reprisals and became something structural and total. The official family account was that the Vales had ambushed a Virelli shipment at the harbor and killed 4 men, and the Virelli retaliation in the following weeks had been disproportionate by design, a message about the cost of crossing certain lines. He'd been a teenager when it happened. He'd inherited the history of it rather than experiencing it directly. Now he sat at his desk at 3 in the morning and read what he had and listened to the rain and thought about the things that histories leave out. He thought about a crest carved into a child's back. He thought about Seraphine flinching when Tomas Bresch crossed the room toward her. He thought about her shoulders changing at the sound of Ravenna Harbor. He pulled up what he had on Tomas Bresch. Loyal family man, had run the harbor district operations for years, was known to have been heavily involved in the Ravenna escalation period. He pulled up what he had on his uncle Lucien, his father's brother, who had been consigliere of the syndicate since before Kael inherited leadership, and who was currently asleep 2 floors above in the same estate. A man of considerable intelligence and considerable ambition, who had navigated the transition of power from Kael's father with the kind of smoothness that Kael had always interpreted as evidence of loyalty. He stared at his uncle's file and something cold settled in the center of his chest and refused to move. He was still staring at it when the first gray light of dawn began to dilute the darkness outside the study window. He hadn't reached any conclusions, but he had reached the beginning of questions that he could already feel, with the particular instinct of a man who has survived by recognizing danger before it fully materialized, were going to change everything. Somewhere in the east wing, a door opened and closed quietly. Seraphine, probably. Moving through a house that wasn't hers, in a life she hadn't chosen, carrying something on her back that she hadn't put there. He thought about what it took to look the way she looked, to carry what she clearly carried, and maintain that particular quality of composed, watchful stillness. The economy of a person who had learned long ago that showing anything was dangerous. He thought about what had taught her that. He thought about the Virelli crest. He closed the file on his uncle and opened a different one, an older one. The original harbor incident records from 15 years ago, the internal family documentation that had been archived when Kael took over leadership. He read with the specific attention of a man looking for gaps rather than content. The places where things were described in language that was slightly too general, the dates that didn't quite line up, the names that appeared in one section and were conspicuously absent from another. He found the gaps almost immediately. And as the rain finally stopped and the pale sky over Blackwater City lightened toward morning, Kael Virelli sat alone with the growing certainty that the war which had consumed 15 years and hundreds of lives and the entirety of his brother's future had not started the way he'd been told it started. And the woman sleeping somewhere in his house knew something about that. Something that people with very significant power and very significant reasons for silence had gone to considerable lengths to make sure she would never say out loud. He closed the archive. He thought about the crest again, the specificity of it, the statement it was meant to make. We were here, we did this, and you will carry the proof of it forever and never be believed. His hands, resting on the desk in the gray morning light, were completely still. But something behind his eyes was not still at all. It was moving fast and getting faster, following a trail through 15 years of lies toward something that he already half knew, and that was going to be, when he finally arrived at it, the kind of truth that couldn't be unknowed. Outside the study window, Blackwater City was waking up to a morning it didn't realize was different from any other. But Kael knew. Something had changed in the last 12 hours. Something that no treaty and no ceremony and no careful architecture of mafia diplomacy was going to be able to contain. He just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost him. He would find out. He picked up his phone and sent a single message to a contact he trusted more than almost anyone. A man who dealt in information rather than violence, and who had proven on 3 occasions that mattered that his discretion was absolute. I need everything on the Ravenna Harbor period, not the official account, the real one. Specifically, any incidents involving a minor in the 18 months prior to the escalation. Any involvement by Tomas Bresch. Any connection to the consigliere's office. He sent it. He set the phone face down on the desk, and he waited, alone in the growing morning light, for the answer that was going to break everything open. The message came back at 6:47 in the morning. Kael had not moved from the desk. He'd made coffee at some point. The cup sat half empty and cold beside his elbow. And he'd gone through the archive files twice more, but mostly he just sat in the particular stillness of a man waiting for something he already knew was going to be bad. The response from his contact was 3 lines. Ravenna Harbor, 14 months before escalation. 1 unregistered detention incident, Harbor Warehouse District, victim age estimated 8 to 11, case buried at precinct level by Captain Harlow Dees, but now deceased. Bresch name appears in a secondary ledger I can't authenticate. 3rd item. You don't want the 3rd item. Kael read it twice. Then he typed back, send the 3rd item. The reply took 4 minutes. The order authorizing the detention came from inside the Virelli administrative structure. Not your father. The signature cipher matches the consigliere's office. Lucien. Kael set the phone down. He sat very still for a long time. Outside, the city was making its morning sounds. A delivery truck somewhere on the road beyond the estate wall, a bird doing something pointless in the garden, the distant bass note of river traffic starting up. Normal sounds, the sounds of a world that didn't know what he was sitting with. He picked the phone back up and typed, how confident? 70%. The ledger is partial, but the cipher is consistent across 3 other authenticated documents from that period. I wouldn't have sent it if I wasn't mostly sure. Mostly sure. Kael stood up from the desk. His back was stiff from the hours in the chair, and he rolled his shoulders once and felt the tension there like ropes pulled too tight. He walked to the window and looked out at the estate grounds in the early light. The gardens were immaculate and empty, the grass still wet from last night's rain, and 2 of the overnight security detail were doing their handoff rotation near the eastern wall, moving with the mechanical ease of men at the end of a long shift. He watched them without seeing them. Lucien, his uncle, his father's brother, the man who had run the administrative and strategic operations of the Virelli syndicate for over 2 decades, and who had, in the years since Kael's father had stepped back from active leadership, become the institutional memory and political architecture of everything the family did. Kael ran the operations. Lucien ran the relationships, the judges, the political contacts, the long-game leverage that kept the syndicate insulated from consequences. Kael had never fully trusted him. That was the honest accounting. He'd always kept a distance, always routed certain decisions around him, always maintained information channels that Lucien didn't know about. Basic operational hygiene. But he'd never had specific cause. And in the Virelli world, without specific cause, you didn't move against your own. You especially didn't move against the man who knew where everybody was buried, sometimes literally. He thought about the crest on Seraphine's back. He thought about a child in a harbor warehouse. He thought about a 15-year war built on a foundation that might be a lie. He left the study. The estate was quiet in the early morning, the household staff moving through their routines with the trained unobtrusiveness of people who had worked in Virelli, employed long enough to understand that what they didn't see couldn't compromise them. Kael moved through the main corridor and up the east wing staircase and stopped outside Seraphine's room. He stood there for a moment. Then he knocked. Silence. Then movement. Then her voice, not sleepy. She'd been awake. "What? I need to talk to you." A pause that lasted long enough for him to consider that she might simply not open the door. Then the handle turned. She'd changed out of the dress. She was wearing dark trousers and a long-sleeved shirt, sleeves pulled fully down to her wrist despite the indoor warmth, and her hair was loose. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for an unpleasant conversation and has made their peace with its arrival. "Come in," she said, and stepped back. He came in. She moved to the chair by the window and sat in it sideways, one knee drawn up, which was the first physically relaxed posture he'd seen from her. He stayed standing near the door. "The harbor incident," he said, 14 months before the Ravenna escalation. "You were there." Something went through her face. Not surprise. The opposite of surprise. The particular expression of someone who has spent years waiting for a specific sentence and is now experiencing its arrival. "How did you find out?" she said, flat. Not a question. "Does it matter?" "No." She looked at the window. The early light made her face look younger and harder at the same time. "No, I suppose it doesn't." "Tell me what happened." "Why?" "Because I need to hear it from you." She was quiet for a long moment. Her thumb moved against the fabric of her sleeve in a small, repetitive motion that she probably wasn't aware of. "I was 9, she said. "My father was meeting with someone at the harbor. He brought me because—" She stopped, exhaled. "He brought me sometimes. To meetings. He thought it made him look less threatening. A man with his daughter." The contempt in her voice when she said that was very quiet and very complete. "There was a vehicle. Men I didn't recognize. They separated us." "How long?" 6 days. Kael said nothing. "They wanted account numbers. Offshore accounts my father supposedly had. I didn't know any account numbers. I was 9 years old." She said it without inflection. The flatness of it was worse than if she'd been angry. "They didn't believe me for quite a while." The room was very quiet. "The Virelli crest," Kael said, "on your back." Her jaw tightened. "A message. For my father. When they returned me." Her voice was absolutely steady, and it cost her something he could see in the tendons of her neck. So he would know who had me, and why, and what they were willing to do, so he could never pretend not to know. "Did he go to my father?" "No." "Why not?" She turned to look at him directly. "Think about that question," she said, and then answer it yourself. He thought about it. He answered it himself. Dominic Vale hadn't gone to Enzo Virelli because going to Enzo Virelli would have meant revealing that someone inside the Virelli organization had operated without sanction, which would have created a crisis of internal accountability that might have resulted in justice. And justice was the last thing Dominic Vale wanted. What he wanted was a war, a full, consuming, years-long war that would justify everything he intended to do in response. He used it, Kale said. He used it, she confirmed. Not immediately. He waited. He built the narrative. The Ravenna escalation happened 14 months later, a genuine Varelli provocation as far as I know, but by then my father had a full private army of rage to deploy against it. He'd been feeding it for over a year. She paused. He never told anyone what actually started it, not the men who bled for it, not the families of the men who died. He just used me as kindling and let 15 years happen. She said the last sentence the way you'd describe weather, like it was simply a condition of the environment that she had learned to operate within. Kyle felt something move through him that wasn't quite anger. Anger was too simple for what it was. It was more structural, something load-bearing inside his understanding of his own life shifting under pressure. The man who ordered it, he said carefully, on our side. Do you know his name? She looked at him for a long time. I was 9, she said. I saw faces. I heard voices. I didn't know names. Another pause. But there was one man who came on the last day, different from the others. He didn't touch me. He just looked, like he was checking a ledger entry. Her voice dropped slightly. Older, thin face, a ring on his right hand with a flat black stone. Kale's uncle Lucien had worn a ring with a flat black stone on his right hand for as long as Kale could remember. He'd always assumed it was some old family affectation. He kept his face completely neutral. Okay, he said. Is that a name you recognize? I don't know yet. She watched him with those clear, measuring eyes. You're lying, she said, without accusation. Just observation. You know exactly whose ring that is. He didn't confirm it and didn't deny it. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh in different circumstances. Welcome to what it's like to know something you can't say out loud, she said. I've been living there my entire life. He left her room the way he'd come in, quietly, carefully, without giving her anything she could use, which he recognized even as he did it was an instinct that was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. She wasn't the enemy. She never had been. She was the person who had been most comprehensively damaged by people on both sides of a war that she hadn't started and hadn't chosen. The problem was that knowing that didn't change the operational reality. If Lucien had ordered the detention, and he was now operating on the assumption that the 70% confidence was conservative, then Lucien had manufactured the conditions for a 15-year war for the purpose of consolidating power inside the Varelli organization, which meant the war had never been about Marco, which meant the grief and rage and 15 years of compounding violence that Kyle had inherited and maintained had been built on a fabrication engineered by his own uncle, which meant Lucien, right now, sleeping 2 floors above in the same estate, was not the loyal consigliere Kyle had managed around and tolerated. He was the architect of everything, and he had been watching Seraphine since she arrived at the reception last night. Kyle had clocked it and filed it, and now he understood what he'd actually been looking at. A man making certain that his liability was still contained. He needed to move carefully. He needed to move fast. These two requirements were in direct opposition to each other. He went to find Dorian. Dorian was in the security office off the main entrance, drinking bad coffee and reviewing overnight incident logs that, in this household, were never entirely boring. He looked up when Kyle came in, registered something in Kyle's face, and set the coffee down. Close the door, Kyle said. Dorian closed it. I need you to pull the visitor logs for the Harbor District warehouses, the ones we controlled in the years before Ravenna, specifically the 6 months prior to the escalation. Dorian's expression moved through several things very quickly and settled on careful. Those records are in Lucien's archive. I know where they are. Kyle, I know where they are, Dorian. I need them without going through Lucien's office and without him knowing they've been accessed. A long pause. Dorian was not a stupid man. He had been with Kyle since they were teenagers, and he understood the weight of what was being asked without needing it explained. How much trouble are we in? Dorian said. I don't know yet. Possibly a lot. Is this about her? It's about a lot of things that go back further than last night. Dorian looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said, Give me 2 hours. Lucien came down to breakfast at 8:15. He was 70 years old and carried it well. The kind of lean, maintained older man who had always been more dangerous than he looked because he'd spent a lifetime letting people underestimate him. He wore a dark suit even at breakfast, which had always slightly irritated Kyle in a way he'd never bothered to examine. He had thin hands and clear, pale eyes, and a quality of organized attention that made conversations with him feel like they were being filed somewhere. He found Kyle already at the breakfast table and settled into his chair with the unhurried ease of a man entirely comfortable in the space. "The ceremony went well," Lucian said. The Vales seemed satisfied. Dominic Vale looked like a man who'd just sold something he didn't want to let go of. A small, precise smile. "Which I suppose is accurate." Kyle drank his coffee and said nothing. "The girl," Lucian said. "Seraphine. Have you had any meaningful conversation with her yet?" "Some." "And your impression?" Kale set his cup down. "Why do you ask?" "Because she matters now, strategically. Her relationship to the Vale organization is the mechanism of the treaty, and if there are any—" Lucian paused with the delicacy of a man choosing words. "Complications in that relationship, they need to be managed early." "Complications like what?" "Old loyalties, old resentments." His uncle's pale eyes were steady and pleasant. "Women from families like hers are raised with certain narratives about families like ours. It would be natural if she carried some of that. It would be worth knowing how much." Kyle looked at his uncle across the breakfast table. "I'll manage it," he said. "I'm sure you will." Lucian picked up his coffee. "I only mention it because I'd like to have a brief conversation with her myself. At some point this week. A welcome. Make her feel that she's genuinely part of the family now. These symbolic gestures matter." Something moved through Kyle's chest that was cold and immediate. "I'll let her know," he said. After breakfast, Kale found Seraphine in the East Wing library. She'd apparently located it on her own during the early morning hours, which he noted. She was standing at the shelves reading the spine of a book she hadn't pulled out, doing nothing, which was the posture of a person who needed to be doing something with their hands and had run out of things. "My uncle wants to have a conversation with you," Kyle said. She turned. She read his face for half a second. "When?" "He said this week. I said I'd pass it on." "And what are you actually telling me?" He looked at her. "I'm telling you that until I have a complete picture of what I'm dealing with, I need you to avoid being alone with him." The air in the room changed slightly. "You know," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have a strong working theory. I need confirmation. I told you this morning, what you told me this morning is what you know from your end. I need what I can verify from mine." He paused. "I'm asking you to give me a few days. And if he pushes for the meeting, tell him you're still adjusting. New environment, new household, you need time. He'll accept that. He has no reason not to yet." She studied him with the particular expression she'd used at the altar, at the reception, in her room this morning. That clear, comprehensive measuring attention. He was realizing how she processed trust decisions. She didn't feel her way toward people. She assessed them like terrain. "A few days," she said. "Yes." "And then what?" "Then I'll know what we're dealing with." "We," she said, the word landing differently than he'd intended it. "Figure of speech," he said, which was and wasn't true. Dorian came back at 10:43 with a portable drive and an expression that had aged him noticeably in the 2 hours since their conversation. He handed Kyle the drive without saying anything. "How bad?" Kyle said. "Define bad." "Just tell me." Dorian sat down. He pressed his hands flat on the desk in front of him like he needed the surface. The harbor warehouse logs from the relevant period show 11 unregistered access events across a 6-month span, all of them cleared through the consigliere's administrative code. 6 different operatives listed in the secondary ledger. And Kyle, 3 of them are still active in the organization. Bresh is one. Kyle was quiet. "There are also communication records," Dorian continued, "encrypted, but our guy cracked the cipher about 18 months ago for a different reason and never had cause to run it back against the old harbor files until now. The communication traffic between Lucien's office and an external party, unidentified, but the routing points toward the Vale administrative structure starts exactly 14 months before Ravenna and runs through the escalation period." Kale looked up. "What?" "I know. He was running communications with the Vale side. With someone on the Vale side, we can't confirm who. But the traffic pattern suggests coordination, not opposition. Dorian's voice was carefully controlled. Someone on the Vale side who also wanted the war to happen. The silence stretched out long enough that the sound of the estate outside the study became audible. Birds, wind against the windows, the distant mechanical sound of the gate mechanism cycling for a delivery. It wasn't just Lucien, Kael said slowly. No. Someone in the Vale organization was a partner in manufacturing the escalation. Different reason, probably, but the same goal. Dorian paused. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking about Dominic Vale, he used his own daughter's suffering as a foundation for a war he'd already decided to start, Kael said. The words came out flat and measured because he didn't trust them not to be otherwise. And somebody inside the Varelli organization gave him the tool to do it. The room was very quiet. The treaty, Dorian said, the marriage. If any of this gets out during the peace process. It won't. Kael stood. Not yet. Not before I understand the full geometry of it. And then? He didn't answer that. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer was the kind that changed everything the moment it was said out loud. The morning moved forward. The estate ran its operations. Seraphine moved through the household with careful self-containment, exchanging minimal pleasantries with staff, taking a solitary walk in the garden that he watched through the study window for reasons he didn't examine closely. She walked with her arms crossed and her head slightly down, and the long sleeves of her shirt pushed down over her hands, despite the afternoon warmth, and she looked like a person navigating terrain that might shift under her feet at any moment, which was accurate. Lucien found Kael in the corridor at 2 p.m. with the specific timing of a man who had arranged the encounter. I've been thinking, Lucien said, falling into step beside him, about the Eastern District restructuring. The treaty gives us grounds to renegotiate the Varenne Street corridor. It's technically Vale territory, but it's been dead space for years, and not today, Lucien. A slight pause. Of course, post-wedding fatigue. The small smile again. There's no rush. These things settle into their natural timeline. He glanced sideways at Kael. Have you spoken with Seraphine about the welcome dinner I mentioned? I was thinking Thursday. She needs more time to adjust. Understandable, though. A careful pause. The longer she remains outside the family's social structure, the more awkward the integration becomes. Better to move quickly, I've always found. It's more humane in its own way. Humane. Kael stopped walking. He turned to look at his uncle directly. Lucien met his gaze with the steady pleasantness he always maintained, that practiced, impenetrable surface that had allowed him to operate inside the Varelli organization for decades without anyone finding a seam. Thursday, Kael said. I'll see if she's ready. Lucien nodded. Good. I'll have the kitchen. I said I'll see if she's ready. Another pause, fractionally longer than the ones before it. Of course, Lucien said. He moved away down the corridor with the unhurried step of a man who felt entirely secure. Kael watched him go. He was running out of days. At 9 that evening, he went back to Seraphine. She was at the window again. Different window. The sitting room attached to her bedroom, looking out at the north garden where the lights were on and the shadows of the old trees moved in the wind. She had a glass of water she wasn't drinking. She looked tired in a way that was different from fatigue. The deeper kind. The kind that sleep didn't fix. Thursday, he said from the doorway. He pushed for Thursday. She absorbed this. Did you hold it? For now. She turned the glass in her hands. He's not going to wait forever. No? And you don't have what you need yet. I have most of it. Most. She set the glass down. Most won't protect either of us. I know. She looked at him with the exhaustion of someone who had been calculating against inadequate resources for a very long time. Tell me what you actually need, she said. Not the careful version, the real one. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I need documented evidence of his involvement that can be presented to enough of the right people inside the organization to produce a legitimate internal challenge. What I have right now creates reasonable suspicion. It doesn't create consensus. And without consensus. Without consensus, any move I make against him splits the organization. Half the captains have been with him longer than they've been with me. If I act without proof that convinces them, I don't just lose Lucien. I lose the syndicate. She was quiet, processing. Then, there's a man named Bresh. He went still. What about him? He was there. At the warehouse, He was there for at least 3 of the 6 days. I didn't know his name then. But last night, when he crossed the room at the reception, she paused. I knew the way he moved, the way he held his shoulders. You don't forget that. Seraphine. He was one of the men following Lucien's instructions. She held his gaze. If you found a way to make him afraid enough, that's not a road I can take right now. If Bresh feels any pressure, he reports directly to Lucien, and then everything accelerates on Lucien's timeline instead of mine. Then what? She said, with the first edge of real frustration he'd heard from her. We wait in this house while he schedules dinners and watches me and plans whatever he's planning? I'm not asking you to wait forever. How long? I have someone moving on the communication records tonight. If we can authenticate the cipher match and identify the Veilside contact, that's 2 simultaneous betrayals. That's consensus. She looked at him. 2 days, he said. Maybe 3. She was quiet long enough that the wind moved against the window glass and the tree shadows shifted in the garden. I've been waiting for something like this for 20 years, she said finally. Not to him exactly, more to herself. I can wait 2 more days. He was almost to the door when her voice came again, quieter. Kael. He turned. The man you're becoming in this... She stopped, seemed to decide something. Make sure it's a man you can live with afterward. He didn't have an answer for that. He left. The message came at 11:47 that night. It was from his information contact, and it was longer than the previous ones. He read it twice, standing at his desk with the lamp on and the rest of the study dark. The Veilside communication partner had been identified through secondary cipher matching against known administrative traffic from the Veil organization over the same period. The coordination had been sustained, detailed, and operational. Not 2 men coincidentally serving similar agendas, but 2 men actively planning the same outcome. The name at the end of the communication chain, authenticated across 4 separate document sets, was Dominic Veil, Seraphine's father. Kael sat down. He read the message a 3rd time. Lucien had provided the mechanism, the detention, the torture, the crest carved into a child's back, and Dominic Veil had provided the narrative. Together they had manufactured a 15-year war that had served both their purposes. Lucien had used the war to consolidate the consigliere's position into something functionally more powerful than the heirs. Dominic Veil had used it to build an army and to position himself as the righteous avenger of a horror he had personally enabled and then deliberately concealed. They had used Seraphine the way you use a match. Strike it, let it burn, and the fire becomes something else entirely. He thought about what to do with this. He thought about Seraphine saying, make sure it's a man you can live with afterward. He thought about 2 days. Then his phone screen lit up with a different notification. Security system. Motion sensor, east wing exterior. He pulled up the camera feed. Lucien's private car was in the east courtyard. The timestamp showed it had arrived 11 minutes ago, during the window when the night security rotation created a 6-minute blind spot in the exterior coverage. A blind spot that Lucien, who had overseen the security design of this estate for 2 decades, knew about better than anyone. The camera covering the east wing corridor showed Lucien himself, in his coat, moving toward the residential section. Toward the east wing, toward Seraphine's room. Kael was moving before he'd consciously decided to move, phone in hand, already typing Dorian's emergency code as he hit the corridor at a dead run, the cold knowledge arriving fully formed and absolute in the center of his chest. Lucien wasn't waiting for Thursday. He was handling the problem tonight. He took the east corridor at a run and didn't bother being quiet about it. The estate at midnight was a different animal than the estate during the day. The household staff gone to their quarters. The formal rooms dark. The security detail reduced to the night rotation that Lucien himself had designed years ago, with gaps that now felt less like oversights and more like preparations. Kael's footsteps hit the hardwood and he didn't soften them because softness was no longer the priority. Speed was the priority. The camera feed on his phone showed Lucien still moving, unhurried, which was somehow worse than if he'd been rushing, the particular unhurriedness of a man who didn't expect to be interrupted. Dorian's acknowledgement came back in 12 seconds. On it. 2 minutes. 2 minutes was too long. Kael hit the east wing door and pushed through it, and the corridor beyond was dim, lit only by the low baseboard's lights that stayed on through the night. And at the far end he could see the shape of his uncle outside Seraphine's door, with one hand raised to knock. "Lucien!" His uncle turned. In the low light, Lucien's face was composed and unsurprised, which told Kael that he'd known the security camera covered this corridor, and had calculated that Kael might be watching it. The surprise wasn't part of the plan. This, being caught in the act of arriving, was acceptable to him. He had a version of this ready. "Kael." His voice was mild. "I couldn't sleep. I thought I'd check on our guest." "At midnight. Old men keep strange hours." The small, precise smile. "I didn't realize you were still up." Kael walked toward him. Not fast. Controlled. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at his uncle in the dim light and felt the specific clarity that arrived sometimes in high-pressure situations. Everything going very still and very sharp, the peripheral noise of emotion going quiet, the operational mind taking over. "Step away from the door," Kael said. Something moved in Lucien's pale eyes, not fear, a recalibration. "I think you're misreading this," Lucien said. "Step away from the door." A pause. Then Lucien moved 2 steps to the side with the controlled grace of a man demonstrating that he was complying voluntarily, which was its own statement. The door opened. Seraphine stood in the frame, fully dressed. She hadn't been sleeping either. And she looked at Lucien first, then at Kael, and something in her face went very flat and very still in the way that Kael now recognized as her danger response. "Go back inside," Kael said to her. "Lock it." She looked at Lucien for one more second, a long second. Then she stepped back and the door closed and the lock engaged with a small definitive sound. Lucien watched this with an expression of patient neutrality. "You're making an assumption," he said. "I'm making an observation." Kael kept his voice level. "You're going to go back to your rooms. We're going to have a conversation in the morning." "A conversation about what exactly?" "About harbor warehouses, about communication ciphers, about decisions made before the Ravenna escalation that certain people in this organization don't know about yet." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Lucien's face didn't change. That was the most instructive thing. A guilty man performs innocence, but Lucien simply went still, the way a very old predator goes still when it's been located by something it needs to assess. His pale eyes moved over Kael with a calculation that was completely undisguised now, as if the social surface of their relationship had been set aside as unnecessary. "You've been busy," Lucien said. "Go to your rooms." Another pause. Then Lucien adjusted the lapel of his coat with one precise gesture and turned and walked back down the corridor without another word, his footsteps even and unhurried all the way to the far door. Kael stood in the dim corridor and listened to his uncle's footsteps disappear and felt the ground shifting under everything. Dorian arrived 90 seconds later, slightly out of breath, with 2 of the night security detail behind him. Kael told him what had happened in 4 sentences. Dorian's face went through several things and settled on the controlled grimness of a man who has been expecting bad news and is now receiving confirmation. "I need eyes on him through the night," Kael said. "Discreet. He can't know he's being watched." "He'll know. Probably, but it slows him down." Kael looked at the locked door of Seraphine's room. "Move her in the morning. Put her in the interior suite. No exterior windows, better camera coverage, 1 access point." "She's going to push back on that." "I know." He went back to his study. He sat at the desk and looked at the authenticated documents on his screen and thought about the morning that was coming and what it required him to do. Moving against Lucien required consensus among the captains. He'd told Seraphine that, and it was still true. What he had now was documentary evidence that was compelling to him, and to Dorian, and to the information contact who had assembled it, none of whom were captains. The captains were men in their 50s and 60s who had built their entire professional identities inside a structure that Lucien had helped architect. Showing them evidence that the Consigliere was a traitor and a predator who had manufactured the war they'd spent 15 years fighting was not a presentation that would be received with immediate clarity. It was the kind of revelation that men resisted because accepting it meant accepting that everything they'd done in service of it was built on rot. He needed one more thing. He needed Bresh. Not the way Seraphine had meant, not pressure applied directly, which would send the signal. Something else. Something that came at it sideways and produced the same result. He thought about it for an hour. Then he called a number he rarely used, belonging to a man named Cassius Fenn, who had been a Virelli captain for 20 years before a territorial dispute had pushed him out of active operations and into a quieter advisory role that mostly involved being old and well-connected and occasionally useful. Cassius was 72 and had the particular value of a man who remembered things that younger men only knew as history. The phone rang 4 times before Cassius answered with the unhurried tone of someone who didn't panic at late-night calls. "It's Kael. I know who it is." A pause. "You didn't call to chat." "No, I need to ask you something about the harbor period, before Ravenna." A longer pause. "That's old ground." "I know. Why now?" "Because something's come up that makes it relevant." Cassius was quiet for a moment. Kael could hear the ambient sound of wherever he was. A television on low, maybe, and the sound of an older house settling. "What do you want to know?" Cassius said. Bresh, during that period. What was he running for the consigliere's office? The pause this time was different. Waited. "Cassius?" "You already know," Cassius said slowly. "Don't you? You've already found something and you're checking it against me. I need a voice, not just documents. A voice who can testify. A voice who knew and stayed quiet and might have different feelings about that now." Another long silence. The television sound in the background went away, which meant Cassius had moved somewhere private. "There were things done during that period," Cassius said finally, "that I wasn't comfortable with. I wasn't involved directly, but I knew. I knew because Lucien had a way of making sure certain people knew. Insurance, you understand. If you know about it, you're implicated by your silence. That's how he operated." Bresh. Bresh ran the operation, directly, hands-on. He reported to Lucien and Lucien reported to Cassius stopped. "Say it. This is going to burn everything down. It's already burning. I'm just trying to control where it goes." A very long silence. "Lucien reported to no one," Cassius said. "That's the answer. He organized it himself, executed it through Bresh, and then managed the fallout when Vale went to war. He'd wanted the war. He needed the war. Your father was pulling back from operations. Health, you remember. The heart issues started that year. Lucien saw a window. A war concentrates power in the administrative structure when the operational head is absent. By the time your father was well enough to reassert himself, the war had become the organization's entire reality, and Lucien had become indispensable. And the girl. Cassius was quiet. "Cassius." "She was collateral damage for both sides," Cassius said, and his voice had the worn quality of something that had been carried a long time. Vale used what happened to her the same way Lucien used the war. Neither of them were... He stopped. "She survived. That's the only grace in any of it." "She's in this house," Kael said. Silence. "As my wife," Kael said. "Signed, witnessed, legal. The treaty is real, which means what was done to her is now my business in a way that it wasn't before." "Kael, I need you in the room when I present this to the captains. I need a voice that predates my tenure, someone they can't dismiss as political maneuvering by the new generation. If I stand up in that room, I know what it costs you. You know what it cost me professionally. You don't know what it cost me to look those men in the face and tell them I knew for 20 years. "No," Kael said. "I don't know that, but I know what it cost her, and the accounting isn't close." A very long silence. "Tell me when and where," Cassius said. Kael set the phone down. He sat in the quiet study and felt the shape of what was coming. The confrontation with Lucien, the presentation to the captains, the potential fracture of an organization he'd spent his adult life holding together. The treaty summit was scheduled for the following week. Both families, senior members, the formal ratification of the peace agreement. He'd imagined using that gathering differently, as a moment of stability, a line drawn under the war. Now he was beginning to see it differently. as the only venue where everything could be exposed simultaneously to everyone who needed to witness it. The problem was that Lucian would see it too. The problem was that Lucian, who had been the smartest man in every room he'd entered for 50 years, was already several steps into whatever plan he was running. Midnight visits didn't happen without preparation. The calm way he'd handled being caught in the corridor meant he'd already accounted for the possibility. He had contingencies. He had 20 years of institutional leverage and 3 active operatives inside the organization who had been with him in the harbor warehouses and who had, as Cassius had confirmed, been kept compliant through the insurance of mutual implication. Kyle needed 2 more days. He wasn't sure he had them. The morning came gray and cold, and with it came the first indication that the timeline had already compressed. Dorian was at the study door at 7 with the tight expression that meant the news was operational rather than administrative. "Bresh left the city last night," Dorian said. "Private car, 2 in the morning. We picked it up on the southern checkpoint footage. He had luggage." Cale went still. Lucien moved him. "That's what it looks like. If Bresh is gone and Lucian controls the access to the harbor period files from his end, he's reducing the exposure points." Cale stood. "He knows I have something. He doesn't know how much, but he's closing the doors." He thought fast. "What about the other 2? The other operatives from the warehouse period?" "Still in the city as of last check, but Kyle..." Dorian hesitated. "There's something else." He handed Cale a phone. On the screen was a message forwarded from the Vale family's liaison contact. Formal language, organizational letterhead, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. Dominic Vale was requesting an emergency pre-summit meeting. Today. Citing concerns about the treaty implementation timeline that required immediate discussion at the senior family level. Today. "He knows too," Kyle said. "Someone told him you've been pulling the old files. Or Lucian reached out to him directly. They were partners once. Maybe they still are." Kyle handed the phone back. The shape of it was becoming clear, and it was not a good shape. Lucien was moving to consolidate. Dominic Vale was moving to preempt. Between the 2 of them, they had enough combined leverage, organizational, financial, political, to bury whatever Kyle had assembled if he gave them the time to coordinate their response. The summit couldn't be the venue anymore. It had to happen before the summit. He thought about Seraphine. He went to find her. She was in the interior suite where Dorian had moved her at first light. She'd accepted the relocation without argument, which told him she'd heard or sensed enough through the night to understand that the situation had moved. She was sitting at the small table with a cup of coffee and her hands flat on either side of it, and the expression of someone running calculations. "Bresh is gone," Kyle said. "Your father is requesting an emergency meeting today. Lucien spent last night reducing his exposure. We're out of time." She absorbed this without visible reaction. "How out of time?" "The summit is in 6 days. If Lucien and your father coordinate before then, anything I present gets framed as a destabilization attempt by a new heir trying to consolidate power by destroying his predecessor. The evidence becomes politically compromised. The captains don't know what to believe, and they default to the structure they've operated inside for decades." "Which is Lucienne." "Yes." She was quiet. "What I need," Cale said, "is to force the confrontation before they align. Today, if possible. Tomorrow, at the latest. In front of enough witnesses that neither of them can contain the fallout." She turned the coffee cup in her hands once. "You need me to be in that room." He said nothing. "You need me to be in that room and say what I know," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't protest. It was the careful measurement of a person counting the cost of a thing they'd already decided. "The documentary evidence establishes the mechanism," Kyle said. "The cipher matches, the ledger entries, the communication records. But evidence can be challenged, contextualized, explained away by men who are motivated to do so. What can't be explained away is me," she said, "is you. Standing in front of men who have to look at you and hear what was done to you and understand what it means about the war they fought." He paused. "I can't ask you to do this. You're asking me. I'm telling you what the situation requires. Whether you choose to be in that room is entirely..." "Stop." She set the cup down. "Stop managing the language around it. You need me there. Say it plainly." He looked at her. "I need you there." She stood. She moved to the window. There was no exterior view from this suite, just an interior courtyard visible through frosted glass, and stood with her back to him in the familiar posture he'd come to recognize as her thinking position. "My father is going to be in that room," she said. "Yes." "And Lucien?" "Yes." "And I'm supposed to stand in front of both of them and in front of all of them, the captains, both families, anyone who matters. That's what makes it impossible to bury." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Kael became aware of the ambient sounds of the suite, the ventilation, the distant sound of the household, her own breathing, which was controlled and deliberate in a way that meant she was working to keep it that way. 20 years, she said. Not to him, to the frosted glass and the gray courtyard beyond it. I've known what my father did with what happened to me. I've known that he chose the war over... She stopped. He chose it. He looked at what those men did to me and he decided it was more useful as fuel than as a crime. Her voice was absolutely level. I've never said that out loud to another person. Kael said nothing. If I'm in that room, she said, there's no version of after where I have a father. Whatever's left of that, she paused, ends. I know. She turned. Her face was composed and exhausted and something else that he didn't have a word for. The expression of a person who has arrived at a decision that has been coming toward them for a very long time and has finally stopped trying to step out of its path. Set up the room, she said. The calls went out through the morning. Kael reached the 6 senior Virelli captains through Dorian's secure line with language that communicated urgency without specifics. An emergency family matter requiring immediate counsel, the estate, 2 o'clock. He reached Cassius directly and told him to be present and to be prepared to speak. He sent a formal response to Dominic Vale's liaison accepting the requested meeting and setting the same time and location, framed as the senior Virelli family's response to the treaty concerns the Vale patriarch had raised. He did not communicate with Lucien. Lucien, who received an invitation through the standard consigliere notification channel, would know by 11 that the meeting had been assembled. He would not know the agenda. He would spend the intervening hours preparing for the versions he could imagine, and the version he couldn't imagine was the one that was actually coming. That was the only advantage Kael had left. The estate's formal reception hall was prepared without explanation to the staff, chairs arranged, the long table set for a working meeting, the secondary doors locked so that the only entrance was through the main hall where Dorian positioned 2 men whose presence was unmistakably operational. Seraphine came to Kael at 1:15. She'd changed into dark clothing, her hair pulled back, her sleeves down. She looked like a woman dressed for an unpleasant task rather than an event. She came to him in the corridor outside the reception hall and stood close enough that he could see the tension in her jaw. If it goes badly, she said quietly, if Lucien has more inside the room than you think, Dorian has people outside every exit. That's not what I'm asking. He understood what she was asking. Then we leave, he said. Through the lower level. There's a passage that connects to the river utility road. I've had a vehicle there since this morning. She looked at him. I'm not going to let anything happen to you in this house, he said. Whatever else is true, that's true. She held his gaze for a moment with that measuring attention. Then she nodded once and looked away toward the reception hall doors. Let's finish it, she said. The captains arrived between 1:30 and 2. 6 men, all over 50, all wearing the particular expression of senior organization members who have been called to an emergency meeting and are professionally committed to not showing that this concerns them. They settled into chairs around the table with the careful seating choices of men who understood that proximity implied alliance. Cassius arrived separately and sat at the far end of the table with the contained expression of someone who has made a decision and is experiencing what that costs. Dominic Vale arrived at 2 with a 4-man escort that Dorian's people required to wait in the outer hall. Vale himself entered alone. Heavy, limping slightly, his face arranged in the expression of a man who has come to manage a problem and is confident in his ability to do so. He took in the room with a single comprehensive look, registered the captains, registered Cassius, and found Kael at the head of the table. His eyes moved once to the door and then back. Seraphine came through it 30 seconds later. Something happened in Dominic Vale's face. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was more complicated than that. The expression of a man who has filed something very far away and is suddenly confronted with the fact that it has been retrieved. He went still in his chair, and his hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, pressed flat. Lucien came in last. He entered with the measured step of a man who had decided on his approach and was committed to it. He surveyed the room. The captains, Cassius, Vale, Kyle, and then Seraphine, whose presence caused a reaction that was almost imperceptible and that Kale caught anyway. A single arrested breath, a fraction of a second's stillness before the smooth forward motion resumed. He took the chair at Kyle's right, which was the consigliere's traditional position. An interesting assembly, Lucien said pleasantly. Kale looked around the table. I'm going to present something, he said. His voice was calm and flat and carried. I'm going to ask everyone in this room to hear it completely before responding. What I present is documented and verified. It concerns the origins of the Virelli Vale conflict and specifically the events at Ravenna Harbor and the period preceding them. He put the drive on the table and opened the documents on the room's display screen. He walked through it methodically. The cipher-authenticated communication records, the harbor warehouse access logs with the consigliere authorization codes, the secondary ledger with Bresch's name and the operational timeline, the cross-referenced communication traffic between the Virelli administrative structure and the Vale organization that began 14 months before Ravenna and tracked precisely with the escalation arc. He spoke without inflection, presenting the materials the way a man presents evidence to people he needs to convince rather than people he needs to perform for. The captains were very quiet. Lucien sat with his hands folded on the table and his face in the expression of patient neutrality he'd maintained for 50 years, and he said nothing. Dominic Vale had gone the color of old concrete. When Kyle finished, Cassius spoke. 3 minutes. His voice was rough, and he didn't look at anyone directly, and he said what he knew and how long he'd known it, and he didn't dress it up. When he finished, the room was silent in a way that had weight to it. Then one of the captains, a man named Riker, 58, who had run the Northern Territories for a decade and whose opinion carried more organizational weight than any other man at the table, said, "This is an accusation against the consigliere. Extraordinary documentation or not, an accusation at this level." "Let her speak," Kyle said. Every head in the room turned to Seraphine. She sat at the end of the table with her hands flat in front of her and her face composed with the specific quality of composure that Kyle now understood was the most hard-won thing about her. The total refusal to perform distress even when distress was entirely justified. She reached up. She pulled back her left sleeve. The room went very still. The scars on her forearm were old and fully healed and clearly deliberate. She turned her arm once so the room could see them. Then she spoke. She spoke quietly and without tremor, and she described 6 days in a harbor warehouse when she was 9 years old, and she described the men, and she described the purpose, and she described the man who came on the last day with the flat black ring, who looked at her the way you'd look at a completed task. She turned her eyes to Lucien when she said that. Lucien held her gaze, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, something in his face moved. It was not remorse. It was the specific expression of a man revising his assessment of a threat level. She reached back. With complete deliberate precision, she drew the collar of her shirt slightly aside and turned so that the table could see the lower part of her shoulder, the old scar. Faded with 2 decades of time, but still clear against her skin if you were close enough and you knew what you were looking at. The Virelli crest. The room's silence became absolute. Riker made a sound. One of the other captains pushed back slightly from the table as if requiring physical distance from what he was seeing. Dominic Vale was completely motionless. Then Lucien moved. He moved fast, faster than a 70-year-old man had any right to move, with the decisive speed of someone who had already mapped the exit and was simply waiting for the trigger. He was out of his chair and his hand was inside his jacket, and Kyle was already moving because he'd been watching for exactly this, had placed himself with this possibility in mind, but Lucien had the years and the preparation and the specific advantage of a man who had been surviving rooms that turned against him since before Kyle was born. The gunshot was a single flat crack that compressed the air in the room and left a ringing silence behind it. Lucien stopped. He stood completely still with his hand still inside his jacket and his head turned toward the sound. Seraphine stood at the end of the table with Kyle's secondary piece, the one he kept under the table edge on a magnetic mount, which she had apparently located and retrieved in the seconds when every eye in the room was on the documents and then on her scars, held in a two-handed grip that was absolutely steady, pointed at the center of Lucien's chest. The shot had gone into the wall 6 inches to Lucien's left. A warning, placed with enough precision that its intentionality was not in question. Her hands did not shake. Her face did not change. The room was motionless. "Sit down," she said to Lucien. Her voice was quiet and completely level. "Or the next one isn't a warning." Lucien looked at her across the length of the table. He looked at the gun. He looked at the room full of captains who were all watching him with the specific expression of men in the process of revising everything. And Kael, standing 3 feet away with his own weapon now in hand, watched his uncle make the calculation and arrive at the answer and slowly, with the controlled grace of a man preserving what dignity the moment allowed, lower himself back into his chair. The silence held. Then Riker said very quietly, "God Almighty." And the room began to come apart. 3 captains were on their feet. 2 of them were on phones. Dominic Vale had not moved, and his face had the blank, devastated look of a man watching a structure he built over decades collapse in real time. Cassius sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded and his eyes down, and the expression of a man paying a debt. Kael looked at Seraphine. She was still holding the gun. Her arms were still perfectly steady, but her eyes, over the sights, had a quality he hadn't seen in them before. Not triumph, not relief, something rawer and more complicated. The expression of a person who has spent 20 years waiting for a single moment and is now inside it and finding that it feels nothing like they imagined. "Seraphine," he said quietly. She exhaled. She lowered the weapon. And that was when the lights went out. All of them. Every light in the reception hall, in the corridor beyond, and the exterior panels visible through the high windows. Simultaneously, completely, leaving the room in the gray afternoon light filtering through the upper glass, enough to see shapes and faces, but not enough for anything else. In the half-darkness, Lucien's chair scraped. Dorian's voice came from the outer hall, loud and urgent. "We've got a breach. South Gate. Multiple vehicles." And from somewhere outside, the sound that Kael had heard enough times in his life to recognize instantly, even through the estate's thick walls. Automatic weapons fire, short controlled bursts, professional cadence. Lucien had not come to the meeting without his own preparations. The captains were shouting. Vale was on his feet. The room was in motion, and the gray light made everything imprecise and dangerous. And Kael grabbed Seraphine's arm and pulled her toward him and put his body between her and the door, and looked at the room full of chaos, and understood with complete cold clarity that whatever controlled presentation he'd been building toward was over. The summit hadn't been the venue. Neither had this room. Lucien had just made the venue the entire estate, and he'd timed it for the moment of maximum exposure, when every senior member of both families was in one location and his external force could achieve in minutes what political maneuvering might have taken weeks. Kael pulled Seraphine close and put his mouth near her ear. "The passage I told you about." She nodded once, tightly. "Stay with me. Don't stop moving for anything." "I know how to run," she said, and her voice was, she knew how to run. He found that out in the first 30 seconds. Kael pulled her through the reception hall's side door and into the service corridor beyond, and she moved without hesitation, matching his pace exactly. Not grabbing at him, not stumbling, not asking questions, just running with the low economical stride of someone who had thought about this possibility before tonight and had made their physical preparations in advance. Her breathing was fast but controlled. Her footsteps were quiet. She kept her body close to the wall the way people learn to do in environments where open space is dangerous. Behind them, the estate was coming apart. The automatic fire from the south gate had been joined by something heavier, a vehicle-mounted weapon, from the sound of it, working across the eastern perimeter in short, deliberate bursts that were designed to suppress the security detail rather than penetrate the structure. Professional. Coordinated. This wasn't improvised. This had been staged and positioned and waiting for the signal, which meant Lucien had spent the hours since the corridor confrontation not panicking but executing, calling in assets that had been pre-positioned against exactly this contingency. Kael had underestimated how long he'd been preparing. The service corridor ran behind the reception hall and the main kitchen and connected through a utility junction to the lower-level access stairs. Kyle had walked it twice in the 48 hours since the wedding, which was 2 more times than his uncle probably thought he had, and he moved through it now from memory, one hand on the wall for orientation in the near dark, the other back towards Seraphine without quite touching her. Dorian's voice came through his earpiece in fragments. South and east both compromised. I've got 4 men down. Repeat 4. The gate mechanism is Kyle. If you can hear me, the inner courtyard is still, then static, then nothing. He pulled the earpiece out and dropped it without breaking stride. Dorian, Seraphine said. I don't know. She didn't ask again. The utility junction was a concrete room the size of a closet where the estate's electrical and plumbing infrastructure converged, smelling of dust and old metal, with a floor hatch in the far corner that opened onto a ladder dropping 10 feet to the lower passage. Kyle lifted the hatch, and the darkness below was complete and cold and smelled of river water and stone. He went first, hit the bottom, steadied himself, reached up. Step onto the ladder. I've got you. She came down without hesitation, found the rungs in the dark by feel, descended with the careful speed of someone prioritizing accuracy over pace. His hands caught her waist at the bottom, and she stepped clear of the ladder, and he let go. How far? She said. 80 meters, then a door, and 20 meters of open ground to the vehicle. What's between us and the open ground? I don't know anymore. She exhaled. Honest answer. He pulled a flashlight from his jacket, small, high intensity, the kind that threw a tight beam rather than broad illumination, and clicked it on and moved. The passage was original to the estate's construction, carved from the same stone as the foundations, low-ceilinged and straight with a slight decline toward the river. Water seeped through the walls in dark streaks, and the floor was slick in patches, and the air was cold enough that their breath showed in the flashlight beam. Kale moved fast and low and listened to the sounds filtering down from above. The gunfire had a different quality now, more distributed, which meant the perimeter breach had widened. He could hear very faintly the sound of men shouting, though the stone swallowed the words. 40 meters in, Seraphine caught his arm. He stopped. She put her mouth close to his ear. Someone's ahead of us. He killed the flashlight. Darkness, complete and immediate. He stood absolutely still and directed his attention forward and found it. A sound that didn't belong to the passage's ambient noise. Breathing. Controlled, deliberate breathing. The kind a trained man produces when he's trying not to be heard and hasn't quite managed it. One person, maybe 8 meters ahead. Kael's hand moved to his weapon. He felt Seraphine shift beside him, and then felt, with a slight shock, the cold metal of the secondary piece she'd taken from the reception hall pressing against his arm. She was handing it back to him, grip first, in the dark, with precise spatial awareness that he found himself filing for later consideration. He took it. He had 2 weapons and 8 meters of dark passage and 1 person who had been sent ahead to close the exit. He crouched, moved forward by feel, one hand on the wall, keeping his footsteps off the wet patches by memory of the floor's texture. Behind him, Seraphine moved in exact correspondence to his pace, maintaining contact with her fingertips against his back, not gripping, just touching, a continuous positional signal. 5 meters. 3. The man ahead breathed out through his nose. Kale came up fast and hit him in the dark with the controlled precision of someone who has done this before, leading elbow to the throat, using the wall to pin him, his knee finding the man's weapon hand and driving it down before the trigger could be reached. The struggle was brief and ugly, and completely silent except for the sounds of physical impact and the scrape of boots on wet stone, and when it was over, the man was on the ground and not getting up, and Kyle stood over him breathing hard through his nose with his heart going at a pace that he consciously worked to slow. Seraphine stood 2 feet behind him. Clear, he said quietly. They moved. The door at the end of the passage was steel, original construction, opening outward with a bar mechanism that Kyle lifted and pushed, and then they were outside in the cold air, and the noise of the assault hit them full and immediate. Weapons fire from multiple directions, at least 2 vehicles burning somewhere on the north side of the estate, judging by the orange light painting the low cloud cover, the sound of the gate structure taking damage. The utility road ran between the passage exit and the river, 50 feet of exposed ground. and the vehicle, a nondescript gray sedan that Dorian had positioned there that morning, was where it was supposed to be with the keys in the magnetic case under the left rear wheel arch. Kyle looked at the open ground, looked at the firelight reflecting off the river surface beyond it, looked at the roofline of the estate behind them, where two of Lucian's external men had positioned on the eastern parapet, and whose attention was currently directed inward toward the estate rather than outward toward the utility road. "When I say go," he said. She was already watching the roofline. "Go," he said. They ran, 50 feet of open ground in the cold dark, the river smell hitting them cold and immediate. No cover, no concealment, just speed. Cale ran with his weapon up and his attention on the parapet, and the two shapes there didn't turn, and they hit the car, and he had the keys in 3 seconds, and the engine turned over, and they were moving before the doors were fully closed, rolling without lights down the utility road toward the river access, staying below the sight line of the estate wall until the road curved into the tree cover along the riverbank. He turned the lights on. He drove. Seraphine sat in the passenger seat with her hands flat on her thighs and her breathing gradually slowing. She looked straight ahead through the windshield at the dark road and the trees moving past and said nothing for 90 seconds. Then, "Dorian." "I don't know," he said again. "I'll find out." "The captains. Some of them will make it out. Riker's been in worse situations than this." He paused. Cassius was near the exterior door when it started. "He has a chance." "And the others?" "Vale's people." Cale drove. "Lucien won't move against the Vale contingent directly," he said after a moment. "Too much exposure. He needs the treaty to hold. It's the political cover for everything. He'll let them go." He paused. "It's us he needs contained." She turned to look at him. "Contained? We're the ones with the documentation and the testimony. Without us in that room, the presentation never happened. He can reframe it. Internal family dispute, new heir making destabilizing accusations, emotional breakdown of a traumatized woman." His voice was flat saying it. "He's reframed things from worse positions than this." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where are we going?" "I have a fallback location. Industrial District, East Side. Used it twice before. Lucien doesn't know it exists." "You're sure?" 70%. She made a short sound. "You like that number." "It's an honest number." They drove for 20 minutes through the back routes of Blackwater City, staying off the main corridors, using the network of service roads and industrial access paths that Kyle had learned over a decade of operational movement through the city. The fallback was a second-floor space above a legitimate electrical supply warehouse, accessed through the warehouse's rear loading dock with a code that changed monthly. Cale parked 2 blocks away, and they walked the last distance through the kind of neighborhood where nobody looked at people moving quickly in the dark, because seeing things created obligations. The space was small and functional. A cot, a workstation, a safe built into the structural wall, 2 weeks of basic supplies, communications equipment that ran on an independent frequency. Kyle had set it up 4 years ago for reasons he'd considered paranoid at the time. He now considered them prescient. He locked the door behind them and stood in the center of the space and let himself breathe. His hands were steady, his mind was working. But under both of those things there was something shaking that he identified after a moment as anger. Not the operational kind he could use, but the deeper structural kind. The anger of a man who has discovered that the foundation of his entire professional life was engineered by someone eating at his breakfast table. Seraphine sat on the edge of the cot and looked at her hands. The gun she'd taken from under the table at the estate was on the workstation where she'd set it when they came in. Her sleeves were still pushed down. In the harsh light of the fallback space, she looked exhausted in a way that the composed surface of her face was no longer fully covering. "Talk to me," he said. She looked up. "About what?" "About whether you're all right." "I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." She held his gaze. "I pointed a gun at a man in a room full of people, and I've been running since, and I haven't processed any of it yet. Whether I'm all right is a question for a different time." "Fair." He moved to the communications equipment and spent 20 minutes trying to raise Dorian through the secondary frequency. Nothing on the first 3 attempts. On the 4th, a burst of broken signal that resolved into Dorian's voice. compressed and staticky, but unmistakably him. Alive, I've got Riker and 2 others. We're out of the estate. Cassius made it. Dorian, can you hear me? Kale, Jesus. Yes, I hear you. Location. Dorian gave a cross street in the harbor district. Kale knew it, a legitimate import business with a Virelli-adjacent relationship that had been useful for exactly this kind of intermediate shelter. Seraphine? With me. We're secure. How bad? A pause that contained its own information. 6 men dead, 2 of them ours, 4 of Lucien's external team that the security detail managed to take down before the perimeter went. The captain split. Riker and Mace are with me. Fenton and Gould went back into the estate during the confusion, and I don't know whose side they came out on. Kale had expected this. Fenton and Gould were old guardmen, decade-long Lucian relationships. What about Vale? His people left during the breach, all of them. Clean exit through the north gate, which wasn't being hit. Makes you think. Another pause. Lucien let them out, Kyle. He opened the north gate himself. I saw it on the remaining camera feed before we lost the system. Kale processed this. Releasing Dominic Vale during the assault wasn't mercy. It was calculation. Vale was an asset. A damaged one now, but still an asset. And eliminating him in a messy estate battle created a different set of problems than keeping him available. They were still partners. Even now, with everything exposed, they were still protecting each other's utility. I need to know where Lucien is going, Kyle said. That one I can answer. Dorian's voice tightened. There's chatter on the frequency we pulled from the external team. Ravenna Harbor. He's moving his primary operation there. The weapons exchange he's had scheduled for 3 days, the one the treaty was supposed to make irrelevant. He's accelerating it. Tonight. Kale went still. Ravenna Harbor. The place where Seraphine's nightmare had started. The place where the war had been staged for public consumption. The place that, by Kale's accounting, had more blood soaked into its concrete and rust than anywhere else in Blackwater City. How many men does he have there? Unknown. But the exchange is major. Multiple external buyers, significant organizational presence. He's moving everything he has left into that location, and he's doing it fast, which means he knows the documentation from today is going to move through the organization, and he needs to complete the exchange and disappear before consensus forms against him. Dorian paused. He's going to be gone by morning, Kyle, with enough money and enough distance that nothing you have follows him. Kale turned. Seraphine was looking at him. She'd heard enough. Her face was doing the complicated thing it did when she was running calculations. That clear, comprehensive assessment that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with decision. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were steady. Ravenna, she said. Yes. He's going there to finish it and disappear. Yes. A long moment. Then that's where we go, she said. Seraphine, don't. Her voice was quiet and absolute. Don't manage this one. He's going to walk away from it, from everything he did, and end up somewhere with money and new documents and no consequences. And my father is going to go back to the Vale organization and rebuild his position and frame today as a destabilization attempt, and in 5 years, nobody remembers the 9-year-old girl in the harbor warehouse. She stopped. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I'm doing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then we do it together, he said. I wasn't assuming otherwise. He reached into the safe and removed what was there. Additional weapons, ammunition, the emergency documentation packet he'd prepared years ago for a situation that required disappearing, and at the bottom, a hard drive containing backup copies of everything his information contact had assembled. He worked quickly and methodically and without wasted motion. Seraphine watched him for a moment. Then she stood and came to the workstation and checked the weapon she'd taken from the estate with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this enough times to do it automatically. Dropped the magazine, checked the round count, reseated it, cycled the action. He watched this without commenting. She caught the look. My father taught me to shoot, she said. The only useful thing he ever taught me. A pause. The irony is not lost on me. They reached Dorian's position at 10:30. The import business's rear space smelled of packing material and diesel and the specific nervous energy of men who had recently survived something and hadn't yet had time to process it. Riker was there, solid, grim, the Northern Territory's captain who had started the day skeptical and had ended it watching a woman expose scar tissue carved by his family's consigliere. He looked at Kael with the expression of a man who has revised his organizational loyalties in real time and is not happy about any of it. "I'm with you," Riker said. No preamble. "Whatever comes next." "Ravenna," Kael said. "Tonight. Lucian's completing the exchange and then he's gone." Riker nodded slowly. "How many men do we have?" Dorian ran the count. Himself, Riker, the 2 men who'd come out of the estate with them, and 3 more who had responded to the secondary frequency in the hour since the estate assault. Men who had been outside the estate during the attack, and whose first loyalty was to the heir rather than the consigliere structure. 8 total. Against an unknown number at Ravenna, organized and dug in and completing a major transaction that would have its own external security presence in addition to Lucian's personal detail. "It's not enough," one of the secondary men said. "It's what we have," Kael said. "What's the play?" Riker said. Kael had been building it in his head since the drive over. Ravenna Harbor was a working industrial facility. Container stacks, crane infrastructure, a network of warehouses along the dock face, water on 3 sides. He'd been there operationally twice in the last 5 years, and he knew the physical layout with reasonable confidence. The weapons exchange would be happening in the main warehouse complex, the same complex, as it happened, where the harbor period detention had taken place, which Lucien was either not thinking about or had decided was a location that held significance for him. 2 teams, Kael said. Dorian takes 4 men through the container approach from the east. Maximum noise, maximum attention. Vehicle lights, weapons visible, force Lucian's detail to commit their response eastward. He paused. Riker, you and 1 other come with me and Seraphine through the water side. There's a maintenance access on the harbor face, original dock construction, opens into the back of the main warehouse complex. You're walking into the building where he is, Dorian said. Yes? With 3 people. 4. Dorian looked at Seraphine. She held his gaze without comment. This is... Dorian started. I know what it is, Kael said. Do you have a better option that ends with him in this city and accountable rather than disappeared to somewhere we can't reach? Silence. No, Dorian said. Then this is the plan. They moved at 11:45. But the drive to Ravenna Harbor took 12 minutes through the industrial corridor south of the city center, the road narrowing as it approached the waterfront into the kind of infrastructure that existed to serve the port rather than impress anyone. The smell of the river changed as they got closer. Less organic, more industrial. The specific combination of salt water and diesel and weathered metal that characterized working harbors everywhere. Kael rode in the second vehicle with Riker and Seraphine and a man named Toll, who had been running waterfront security for the syndicate for 6 years and knew Ravenna Harbor's physical layout as well as anyone. Toll drove. Riker sat in front. Kael and Seraphine were in the back. The harbor lights were visible before they arrived. The tall crane towers lit for night operations. The dock face illuminated by industrial floods that threw harsh flat light across the container stacks. Even from 2 blocks out, Kael could see the configuration of activity. 4 vehicles in the main yard, additional lighting in the warehouse complex that didn't correspond to normal harbor operations. The specific human density of a significant transaction in progress. Lucien had not delayed. He's already running it, Riker said quietly. Yes. Kael studied the layout. Dorian's team in 3 minutes. We move when we hear the east approach. He turned to Seraphine. In the low light inside the vehicle, her face was composed and exhausted, and something else. The focused stillness of someone who has arrived at the moment they've been moving toward for a very long time. She looked back at him with the clear measuring attention that he had come to understand was the most honest version of her face. You don't have to go into the building, he said. We've had this conversation. I'm saying it once more. I know. She looked out the windshield at the harbor lights. 20 years ago, that building had me in it, and I couldn't do anything about it. Tonight, it doesn't. A pause. I'm going in. He didn't argue. Dorian's vehicles hit the east approach at exactly the 3-minute mark. Headlights on full, weapons visible, moving fast along the container road with the deliberate visibility of a force announcing itself. The effect on the harbor yard was immediate. Shouting, movement, Lucian's external detail breaking from their positions toward the east, the transaction in the warehouse complex momentarily disrupted. Kael was out of the vehicle before the echo of the first shot from the east approach had finished moving across the water. They moved fast along the dock face. Kael, Seraphine, Riker, Toll, keeping low and tight against the harbor wall where the industrial floods didn't reach. The water black and immediate 10 feet to their left, the crane structures looming overhead. The maintenance access was exactly where Kael remembered it. A steel door flush with the harbor wall, secured with a mechanism that Toll had a bypass for from his years of legitimate access. 20 seconds, and the door opened, and they were inside. The back of the warehouse complex smelled of rust and salt water, and old concrete and something else. An older smell beneath the industrial surface, the smell of a space that had been used for things that left marks in the walls and floor. Seraphine registered it. Kyle saw it in the way she breathed. A single long inhale through her nose, and then a controlled exhale, and then she was moving again, weapon up, following Toll's lead through the maintenance corridor. The sounds of the exchange were audible now. Voices, movement, the mechanical sounds of a transaction involving physical cargo. Kale counted at least 6 distinct voices ahead, with more moving sound that suggested additional bodies. The external buyer's security presence would be focused on the product and the payment and on the disturbance at the east approach. Lucien's personal detail would be splitting attention between the transaction and whatever Dorian's feint was producing. The maintenance corridor opened into a structural space behind the main warehouse floor, a gap between the outer wall and the interior storage system, 3 feet wide and running the full length of the building, with slotted ventilation openings that provided visibility into the warehouse floor without exposure. Kyle moved to the nearest opening and looked through. The main warehouse floor was lit by portable industrial floods that turned the space harsh and shadowless. Containers and equipment pallets formed a rough rectangle in the center, and within it, 7 men were arranged around a transaction in progress. Weapons cases open on folding tables, a separate section for the payment verification process. 2 men who, by their positioning and clothing, were external buyer security, one who was clearly the buyer's representative, and 3 of Lucien's operational men, and Lucien himself. Standing at the far end of the transaction space, in his coat, hands clasped behind his back, watching the proceedings with the same organized attention he brought to breakfast. He looked, Kale thought, precisely like himself. Like a man at work. Like nothing that had happened in the preceding 12 hours had fundamentally disturbed him. Beside Lucien, slightly behind, stood Dominic Vale. Of course, Kale stared at Dominic Vale's heavy silhouette in the warehouse light and understood the final piece of the geometry. Lucien hadn't released Vale from the estate assault out of asset management calculation alone. He'd done it because Vale was his exit strategy. The Vale organization's infrastructure, its financial channels, its network outside Blackwater City. 2 men who had built a war together were now using it to disappear together. He became aware of Seraphine at the slot beside him. She was looking through at her father. He watched her face. It went through something that he had no language for. A long, complex, entirely silent reckoning that moved through her features like weather moving through a landscape. And at the end of it, what remained was not the controlled composure he'd come to know, but something harder and more elemental. The face of a person who has stopped waiting for the story to be different than it is. She looked at Kyle. He looked at her. She tilted her head toward the warehouse floor with the precise economy of a woman who is done with every version of this moment except the one that ends it. He nodded. He turned to Riker and Toll and held up 3 fingers, and they understood and moved to their positions, and Kyle put his hand on the access door in the structural wall and felt his heartbeat in his palm, and looked one more time through the ventilation slot at his uncle, standing 60 feet away in the same harbor warehouse where a 9-year-old girl had been held in chains while men argued above her. And he breathed out through his nose and felt 20 years of everything compress into a single, clear, cold point. He opened the door. "Lucien," he said. His voice carried across the warehouse floor, and every head turned and the transaction froze, and Lucien turned with the unhurried precision of a man who had been expecting this and had decided on his response, and his pale eyes found Kyle across 60 feet of harsh industrial light, and the expression in them was the most honest thing Kyle had ever seen on his uncle's face. Not fear, not surprise. Respect. The specific cold respect of a predator for something that has finally shown its teeth. And then Lucien's right hand moved, and three things happened simultaneously. Lucien's detail went for their weapons. The external buyers broke for cover behind the nearest container stack, and Dominic Vale, who had turned at the sound of Kyle's voice and found not Kyle, but Seraphine, standing 3 feet to his left in the harsh light of the warehouse where his daughter's childhood had ended. Dominic Vale went completely still. Not the stillness of a man making a tactical calculation. The stillness of a man whose body has received information that his mind is not yet ready to process. A total systemic arrest. The way a clock stops when something critical breaks inside its mechanism. He stood in the harsh industrial light of the warehouse and looked at his daughter, and the color left his face in a single visible wave, like water draining from a vessel with a crack at the base. Seraphine looked back at him. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Everything she had never been allowed to say out loud was present in the way she was standing. The weight she carried in her shoulders, the specific quality of her stillness, 20 years of a thing that had never been named between them now named, completely, by her simple presence in this particular building. Then the shooting started and the moment broke. Lucien's detail moved first. 2 men coming off their positions toward the near container stack with weapons up, professional and fast. And Kyle was already moving laterally to use the structural wall as cover, Riker going the opposite direction to split the response, Toll dropping low and forward. The external buyer's security had retreated behind the cargo pallets and for the moment were focused entirely on not being caught in something that had nothing to do with their transaction, which removed them as an immediate variable. The warehouse floor became a geography of noise and movement, and the specific controlled chaos of trained men trying to kill each other in an enclosed space. Kale came around the container stack's edge and took down the first of Lucien's detail with 2 shots, close range, the man spinning and going down against the corrugated wall with a sound of impact that registered in Kyle's chest even as he was already moving to the next angle. The second man had Riker in his sights from across the floor and didn't register Kyle's approach until the last second. Registered it, and turned, and they were close enough that the shots from both of them went wide, and then it was physical, and Kyle drove him into the floor with the full weight of forward momentum, and it ended there. But he came up breathing hard. His left side hurt where the edge of something had caught him during the fall. Not deep, he assessed quickly, but bleeding. He didn't have time to think about that. Across the warehouse floor, Toll was down. Not dead. He was moving, trying to get upright, one hand pressed to his right thigh with the specific posture of a man dealing with a leg wound. But down. Which left Riker, who had pinned the remaining operational man behind the cargo pallets, and Kyle, who was now scanning the floor for the 2 things that mattered most. Lucien. And Seraphine. He found Seraphine first. She was at the far end of the warehouse floor, near the loading dock doors, and she was not running. She was standing 6 feet from her father with the weapon at her side. Not raised, not holstered, simply held. And Dominic Vale was standing with his back against the dock doors and looking at her with the expression of a man being asked to account for something he has never accounted for. Kyle looked for Lucien. Gone. The position where his uncle had been standing was empty. The transaction table was overturned. The external buyers and their security had moved toward the north exit during the firefight's first 30 seconds. Gone, transaction abandoned. The specific survival instinct of men who deal in illegal commerce and understand when a situation has become someone else's problem. Lucien had used the chaos. Of course he had. 20 years of running a syndicate had produced a man who moved through disorder the way water moves through a cracked structure, finding the gaps, following the path of least resistance toward the exit. He knew this building. He'd operated in it. He'd known exactly where the secondary exit was, the one that came out on the water side of the dock, and he'd moved for it the moment the firefight began. Kyle started moving. He crossed the warehouse floor at a run, past Seraphine and her father without stopping, caught 1 second of her face, which was doing the hardest thing he'd ever watched a human face do, and kept running, and hit the secondary exit door at the back of the warehouse and pushed through it into the night air. The dock face extended 20 meters beyond the warehouse exit, before it met the water. A narrow working platform of weathered concrete with rusted bollards and old chain infrastructure, and at the far end the skeleton of a fixed crane that had been out of service for years. The harbor lights from the main yard didn't reach this side. The only illumination came from the low orange glow of the city reflected against the cloud cover and the black movement of the river water below. Lucien was at the far end of the dock. He'd reached the crane structure and was moving around it towards something that Kael, running the 20 meters of dock with his lungs burning and his left side throwing pain with each stride, identified as a rigid inflatable boat tied to the dock's lowest rung. A boat that had been there before tonight, pre-positioned, because of course it had been, because Lucien had been planning exits since before Kael was old enough to understand what exits were. Lucien. His uncle stopped. He turned slowly, with his hands slightly out from his sides, not raised, not threatening, simply visible. He stood at the edge of the dock with the boat below and behind him and the river beyond and looked at Kael across 15 feet of wet concrete. "You're bleeding," Lucien said. "Yeah." "How bad?" "Not bad enough." Kael kept his weapon level. "Step away from the boat." Lucien looked at him. The pale eyes were clear and steady and entirely without the performed pleasantness that had characterized every interaction Kael had observed through the layers of family politics. This was the face underneath, sharp, assessing, completely undecorated. "You won't shoot me," Lucien said. "Don't do that." "You're Enzo's son. The instinct runs deep. Family doesn't—" "I said don't do that." Kael's voice was flat. "Use the next 30 seconds to say something real, or don't use them at all." A long pause. The river moved below them. Somewhere back in the warehouse, gunfire had stopped. The distant sound of Dorian's east approach, vehicles shouting, continued its work of holding Lucien's remaining external force occupied. "You found more than I thought you'd find," Lucien said. "The communication records. I was confident that authentication was beyond your contact's capability." A pause. "I underestimated him." "You underestimated her too." Something moved in Lucien's face. "The girl?" "My wife," Kael said. "Say it right." Another pause. Lucien's gaze moved to Kael's left side where the bleeding was showing through his jacket, then back to his face. "You've already transmitted the documentation," he said. "That's why you're here in person, because the evidentiary structure is already in motion and you don't need the physical confrontation to complete it. So why are you here?" Kael said nothing. "Because she needed to be in the building," Lucien said. Not cruelly, with the flat precision of a man reading a situation accurately. "Because 20 years ago, this building—" "Stop." Lucien stopped. "Marco," Kael said, "did you know he was going to be shot?" The silence that followed was the longest of the night. "That was Vale's action, Lucien said. "I know it was Vale's action. I'm asking if you knew it was coming." More silence. "Marco was going to reform the organization," Lucien said finally. His voice was different now, but not the organizational conciliary tone, not the careful political register, something older and more stripped down. He wanted to legitimize, transition the financial infrastructure, reduce the operational profile. He had plans. A pause. "Your father was listening to him." "That's not an answer to what I asked." "No," Lucien said. "It isn't." The river moved. The wind came off the water cold and smelled of depth. "I didn't order it," Lucien said. "I knew the timeline. I didn't interfere with it." Kael stood with his weapon level and felt the thing he'd been carrying for 15 years. The grief that had been packaged as vengeance and deployed as professional identity shift inside his chest and settle into a different shape. Not released. Transformed. The understanding that the death that had defined everything had been, at its base, two old men's arithmetic. Marco's life weighed against the value of institutional continuity, found insufficient. "Step away from the boat," Kael said. "Kael, last time." Lucien looked at him. For a long moment, the two of them existed in the specific suspended geography of a decision being made. The accumulated weight of blood and history and 15 years of a war built on engineering bearing down on a single point of concrete above black water. Then Lucien moved. not toward the boat. He took 2 steps forward and stopped, which put him in reach of nothing and clear of the dock edge, and he clasped his hands in front of him with the controlled dignity of a man who has decided on the terms of his surrender. "Make it clean," he said, "whatever comes next. Don't let it be—" "You're not being executed," Kael said. "You're going to stand in a room and answer for it. To the men whose families bled for the war you manufactured, to the organization you spent 20 years using." He paused. "You're going to be seen, every piece of it, by everyone who has a right to see it." Something moved across Lucien's face that Kael had never seen there before. It took him a moment to identify it because it was so foreign on those features. It was fear, not of death, of exposure, of 20 years of careful construction being taken apart in front of people who had trusted the construction. "That's a worse thing," Lucien said quietly. "I know," Kael said. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and gave the signal whistle for Dorian's team that meant secure and hold. He heard it acknowledged from the east side of the harbor. He walked to his uncle and took the weapon from inside Lucien's coat and put his hand on Lucien's arm and walked him back into the warehouse. Inside, the scene had settled into the specific aftermath geography of a firefight concluded. Riker standing over the secured remaining operative, Toll sitting against the wall with his leg wound packed with his own jacket, the transaction materials scattered across the overturned furniture, the industrial floods still burning their harsh, indifferent light across everything. Dominic Vale was sitting on the floor near the loading dock doors. Not because anyone had put him there. He had simply lowered himself to the floor at some point during the confrontation's end, with his back against the corrugated wall and his hands in his lap, and his face in the expression of a man who has watched a structure he built over 20 years come down in a single night, and has not yet decided what to be in the absence of it. Seraphine was standing 10 feet away from him. She was not pointing the weapon at him. She was just standing there, and the distance between them, 10 feet of warehouse floor and 20 years of everything, was its own complete statement. Kael brought Lucien into the space, and Riker moved to take custody of him without being directed, and then Kael walked to Seraphine and stopped beside her and looked at Dominic Vale on the floor. Vale looked up. He looked at Kael, and then at Seraphine, and then back at Kael with the eyes of a man looking for an angle and finding none. "This is finished," Kael said. "Whatever you thought you were going to walk away with tonight, the transaction, the exit, the alliance with Lucien, it's finished. The documentation has been transmitted to 4 separate recipients, including 2 federal contacts who will be moving on it within 24 hours. Vale's jaw tightened. "The treaty stands," Kael continued. "The Valley Agreement was witnessed and signed, and I have no interest in reopening the war. But you," he paused, "you are not the treaty. The treaty is a document. You're a man who used his 9-year-old daughter as an instrument of political strategy, and then spent 20 years ensuring she could never say so." He kept his voice level. "The federal documentation covers your financial complicity in the harbor period events. Where that goes is between you and the authorities. I'm not judge or jury." Vale said nothing. Kael turned to Seraphine. She was looking at her father with the expression that had no simple name, the face of someone who has wanted a thing for a very long time, and has arrived at it and found that it feels nothing like resolution and everything like the moment after something breaks, when the sound has stopped and the shape of what was there is gone, and you're standing in the space where it was. "Is there anything you want to say to him?" Kael said quietly. "This is the last time this conversation is available." A long silence. "No," she said. She turned and walked toward the warehouse's maintenance corridor and didn't look back. Kael looked at Dominic Vale one more time. Vale was looking at the floor where his daughter had been standing. His hands in his lap were very still. He looked, in that moment, like what he actually was. An old man on a concrete floor in a building that smelled of rust and consequence, stripped of every layer of strategy and narrative and political architecture, with nothing left but the fact of what he'd chosen. Kael left him there. Dorian's team secured the harbor in the hours that followed, with the controlled efficiency of men who understood that the night's work had to be clean if it was going to hold. The external buyers had disappeared into the city and would stay disappeared. Men in their business didn't file reports. Lucien's external force, stripped of leadership and purpose, dispersed when it became clear the operation had collapsed. What remained at Ravenna Harbor by 2 in the morning was a warehouse full of evidence. 4 secured prisoners, including Lucian and Vale. 2 captains whose organizational loyalty had been permanently realigned by the night's events, and 7 people who were exhausted and bleeding in various degrees. Toll's leg wound was serious enough that Dorian drove him to a medical contact before anything else. He would keep the leg, probably. He didn't complain about it, which Kael noted and filed with the respect he had for men who didn't confuse suffering with weakness. Kael's own left side, assessed properly in the warehouse's light, turned out to be a deep graze, ugly and bleeding, but not structurally serious. Riker bound it with materials from the emergency kit in Dorian's vehicle, with the practiced impersonality of a man who had done field dressing often enough that wounds had stopped being dramatic. "You should have a doctor look at it," Riker said. "Tomorrow." "Tonight." "Tomorrow," Kyle said. "There are things to do tonight." The things he meant were the transmissions. He spent 90 minutes in the harbor office with Dorian running through the documentation packets, confirming receipt by all 4 designated recipients, including the 2 federal contacts who, by 7 in the morning, would be in communication with the investigative structures that had been circling Blackwater City's criminal ecosystem for a decade without finding a viable entry point. What Kael was giving them was not just an entry point. It was a complete architectural diagram. It would dismantle both organizations, systematically and thoroughly and probably irreversibly. He was aware, doing this, of every version of himself that had existed before tonight. The version that had been taught to protect the family name. The version that had inherited the war and worn its justifications like a skin. The version that had negotiated a treaty and married a woman and believed himself to be managing a controlled transition towards stability. Each of those versions had done things in service of a structure that he was now, deliberately and with full understanding of the implications, destroying. He didn't feel clean doing it. He wasn't sure he was supposed to. He felt like a man who has made the only choice available to him and is now living in the consequences of it, which was a different thing from righteousness and more honest. Seraphine found him at the harbor office window at 3:30 in the morning, looking out at the dock face where the fixed crane stood against the pre-dawn sky. She came in quietly and stood beside him and looked out the same window, and neither of them said anything for a while. "It's done," he said. "I know. The federal contacts have everything, both organizations. It'll take months to fully process, but the structure is finished." He paused. "The treaty survives in the sense that the war is over. The organizations that were parties to it don't survive in the same form." She nodded slowly. "Your father will be detained within 24 hours, he said. "The charges are significant. I don't know what the outcome looks like on his end." He paused. "I thought you should hear that directly." She was quiet for a moment. "And Lucy Yen?" "Same timeline, possibly worse. The harbor period documentation is more direct on his involvement. The federal case will be straightforward." He looked at her profile in the window light. "I need you to understand that this means testimony. At some point, what you know said in front of people with the authority to act on it." "I know." "It won't be easy." She turned to look at him with the clear, exhausted eyes that had, he realized, never looked anything other than clear. Not through the ceremony, not through 2 days in a house with a man making calculations around her, not through a warehouse confrontation that would have broken most people. "Nothing about any of this was easy," she said. "One more thing that isn't easy isn't going to be the thing that breaks me." He believed her. Outside, the pre-dawn light was beginning to differentiate the sky from the water. Barely. A gradation from black to the particular dark gray that preceded color. The crane structure at the end of the dock was becoming visible as an outline rather than an absence. "What happens to you?" she said. "After. The organization is gone. Your name is—" She paused. "Finished," he said. "The Varelli name in Blackwater City ends with this. There'll be men who try to rebuild fragments of it, but the central structure is gone." He was quiet for a moment. "I made peace with that somewhere around the second transmission." "And before that?" "Before that, I was still deciding." She absorbed this. "My father groomed me for this marriage," she said. It came out level and direct, the way she said things that cost her to say. "From the moment the treaty started being discussed, he positioned me, shaped my conduct, approved everything I wore and said in public contexts, for 2 years. A pause. "Everything about how I presented myself in that treaty process was his architecture. Kael looked at her.
I want you to know that, she said, so that whatever you think you know about who I am, you're looking at a performance that was designed by a man with an agenda. The real version is somewhere under that, and I haven't had access to it in a very long time. She met his eyes directly. I don't know what it looks like yet. I thought you should know that before whatever comes next gets decided. It was, he thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years.
I don't know what I look like either, he said. Without the organization, without the war. Those things were the entire shape of my adult life, and they're gone as of tonight. He paused. I figure that's something to find out, not something to already know. She looked at him for a long moment. That's an unusually reasonable position, she said, for a man who runs a crime syndicate. Ran. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one, which was the closest he'd seen and which felt, under the circumstances, like something significant. He looked back out the window. There's a place, he said. North Coast, 2 hours from here. A property that's registered under a name that has no connection to any of this. I set it up 3 years ago for reasons I never fully articulated to myself. Small, near the water. He paused. I'm going there. After this is properly handed off and Dorian has everything he needs to manage the transition to the federal process. He stopped. I'm not asking you anything. I'm just telling you where I'm going. She was quiet. The dawn light continued its slow work on the harbor, finding the surfaces of things, the water, the crane, the old dock face, and making them visible one increment at a time. I need to not be Seraphine Vale for a while, she said carefully. That's achievable. I need time to... She stopped. To find out what's under the architecture, like you said. Yes. Another silence. 2 hours north, she said. Yes. She looked out the window at the emerging shape of the harbor in the early light. He watched her profile and thought about everything the last 4 days had consisted of. The ceremony, the scars, the dark corridor, the 2-day race through evidence and danger toward a warehouse at the end of the world. The specific quality of her courage, which was not the performed kind but the earned kind, the kind that comes from having already survived the worst thing and knowing you can bear what follows. She didn't answer him directly. What she did was turn from the window and walk to the office door and pause with her hand on the frame. Tell Dorian to give me 20 minutes to find something clean to change into, she said. She left without waiting for his response. He stood at the window a moment longer. Outside, a fishing boat was making its way down the harbor channel in the early light, running lights still on against the gray pre-dawn, its engine a low, steady note across the water. Ordinary. Deliberate. Moving from one place to another because that was what it did and the tide permitted it. He turned from the window. The months that followed happened the way things happen after a structure collapses. Not all at once, but in sequences of consequence that moved through the city like aftershocks. The federal investigation opened formally within 48 hours of Kael's transmissions and expanded quickly, the way investigations do when someone hands them a complete architectural diagram and the key to every locked room. The financial networks, the political leverage files, the judicial relationships, the criminal records that went back decades, it all came into the light in the methodical, impersonal way of institutional process, which was its own kind of justice, lacking poetry but thorough. Lucien Varelli was formally detained on the 41st day. The arraignment was not covered significantly by the local press. The editor of the Blackwater City Courier had, as it turned out, been one of the leverage files, and his replacement had not yet developed strong opinions about what deserved front-page treatment. Those who needed to know, knew. Dominic Vale was detained 6 days later, the delay occasioned by a brief and unsuccessful attempt to access a financial exit through a Portuguese bank account that one of the federal financial analysts identified and closed within 14 hours. He did not resist the detention. There were accounts of him looking, when he was taken, like a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and felt a species of relief at its arrival, though Kael, when he heard the second hand from Dorian, took it for the self-serving narrative that men tell about their own downfalls. Tomas Bresch was found in a coastal town 400 kilometers south of Blackwater City, in a rented house that he had been occupying for 11 days. He was alone. He had not apparently been contacted by Lucien after his departure, which suggested that Lucian had considered him a closed door rather than a resource, a man made redundant by the collapse of the structure he'd been used to protect. He gave a complete statement to the federal investigators on the second day of his detention, with the thoroughness of a man converting the currency of his knowledge into whatever reduced consequence it could purchase. It purchased some, not much. Cassius Venn's testimony was the documentary foundation of the federal case, supplemented by the cipher-authenticated records and the harbor period operational logs. He testified in a closed session that lasted 2 days and was described by one of the investigating attorneys, in a context where he thought he wasn't being quoted, as the most comprehensive organized crime testimony he had encountered in 20 years of practice. Cassius did not apply for protection. He returned to his house and his television and his habit of answering late-night calls with unhurried calm, and when Dorian called him 3 weeks after the testimony to ask how he was, he said, "Carrying less weight than before, which will have to be enough." Riker took the remnants of the Northern Territories operation through a process of deliberate dissolution, paying outstanding organizational debts, returning properties to legitimate titling, closing the financial structures that connected the operation to the broader syndicate. He did this with the methodical grimness of a man cleaning up someone else's mess that he had, by long association, made partly his own. He was not prosecuted. The federal investigators determined that his cooperation and his role in the Ravenna Harbor events constituted sufficient grounds for a different category of accounting. He opened a legitimate security consulting business on the west side of the city and developed a reputation for being intensely competent and not very sociable. Dorian managed the transition for 4 months and then, in a conversation with Kyle over a secure line, said that he was done. Not angry done. Finished done. He wanted to go somewhere that didn't smell like the harbor. He went north, not as far north as the coast where Kyle had gone, but far enough. He sent a message every few weeks. Not much content. Just proof of continued existence, which Kyle understood was a form of loyalty that had evolved beyond its original professional context into something that didn't have a professional name. The property on the north coast was smaller than the word property suggested. A main structure in weathered timber that had been a working marina facility at some point in its history, with a repair dock that extended over the water, and a yard that held, when Kyle arrived, a collection of small boat hulls in various states of disrepair that someone had apparently been meaning to get to for years. He started getting to them. There was something specific about the work. Stripping old fiberglass, grinding rust from fittings, the particular problem-solving of making a broken thing functional again, that engaged the part of his mind that had previously been fully occupied by the architecture of organizational violence. It wasn't peace exactly. It was engagement with something that had clear inputs and visible outcomes, and that did not require him to calculate what anyone else was going to do. He was bad at it for the first 2 months. He became less bad at it. Seraphine arrived 8 days after him with a single bag and the specific expression of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it and is not interested in discussing the process by which they arrived at it. She stood in the yard among the broken boat hulls and looked at the water and at the modest weathered structure and at the particular emptiness of a place that was very far from everything that had previously constituted her life. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes, I'm going to need something to do." He had, somewhat ambitiously, acquired through an intermediary the business registration and operational license of the marina's former repair operation. He handed her the documentation folder without comment. She looked through it. "You registered this under a different name." "Both of ours are under a different name." She looked up. "What name?" He told her. She looked at the folder for a moment. Then she closed it and set it on the hull of the nearest boat and looked out at the water where the fog was moving across the gray surface in slow formations. "I've never had my own name," she said. "My whole life, just a name that belonged to someone else's story." "This one's ours," he said, "if you want it." A long silence. The water moved. The fog moved through it. "I want it," she said. The marina repair operation was modest and functioned at the speed of the local economy, which was not fast. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, the occasional commercial vessel that needed work, the larger facilities to the south charged too much for. Seraphine turned out to have a facility for the administrative and customer-facing side of it, the scheduling, the cost estimates, the management of the relationship between what people wanted and what was actually possible, that she had not previously known she had. and that Kyle recognized as the same organized clarity she applied to every other problem she encountered, redirected towards something that left things working rather than burning. He did the physical work. His hands learned things that they had previously only known about from a distance. There were hard periods. The federal case required Seraphine's testimony in a formal session 8 months after Ravenna, and she traveled south for 3 days and came back quieter than she'd left, and it took 2 weeks before the quietness lifted into something more ordinary. He didn't press it. He was learning, in the time away from the life that had required constant pressure, the different shape of a patience that wasn't tactical, not waiting for information, not managing toward an outcome, just being present with another person in the particular complexity of their recovery without requiring it to be tidy or fast. He was not naturally good at this either. He became less bad at it. There were nights when she woke from something that had happened in the years between 9 and the present, and the darkness of the North Coast had a quality that was different from the darkness of Blackwater City, and he would hear her moving through the small structure and he would leave her to it unless she came to where he was. And sometimes she did, and when she did, they talked about other things. The boat currently on the dock, the weather system moving in from the northwest, the particularly intractable sourcing problem for a specific type of marine sealant. And the conversation was not about the thing that had woken her, but the act of it was about that thing. And both of them understood this without saying it. One evening in the second year, they were on the dock as the light went. The water was the particular color of pewter that it got in the late afternoon before the sun fully dropped, and the fishing boats that worked the outer reach were coming in on the tide, their running lights coming on one by one in the growing dusk. Seraphine was sitting on the dock edge with her feet not quite reaching the water and her sleeves, for the first time that he had seen, rolled up to the elbow. The scars were visible in the last light. The old marks, the evidence of old things, present and not hidden. She wasn't displaying them. She was just not hiding them, which was a different thing, and it had apparently happened without drama on this particular evening because the temperature was warm enough that sleeves were uncomfortable, and the reason to keep them down had, at some point, become smaller than the simple comfort of being cool. He sat beside her and looked at the boats coming in. "Dorian says the Eastern Territories charges got expanded," she said. "The financial case." "Yeah, he mentioned it. Does that—" She paused. "Is there any blowback that reaches here?" "No. Everything that comes out of the case moves away from us. That was the structure of the transmissions." He paused. "We don't exist in any of those documents in ways that lead here." She nodded. They watched the boats. "I talked to someone," she said, "last week, a professional, in the town. He absorbed this. How was that?" "Strange. Useful." "Strange." She picked at a splinter on the dockboard with her thumbnail. "She asked me to describe what my life looks like now. I had trouble with it. Not because it's bad. Because I've never had a life that was—" She paused. "This unremarkable. And I didn't have language for unremarkable. Everything in my language was crisis vocabulary. And now I'm learning different words." She looked at the water. "It's slower than I'd like." "Most things worth learning are." She was quiet for a moment, then, without looking at him, "You burned the blood oath documents. At the church. The ones you mentioned in Dorian's debrief. The Virelli founding documents. Yes. The ones that established the original organizational structure. The oath of blood continuity." He paused. "I burned them before Ravenna. Kept the ash." "Why the ash?" "I don't know exactly. They were my grandfather's documents, and his father's before that. I destroyed the thing they represented, but I didn't want to pretend the history wasn't real." He looked at his hands on the dockboard. "The history is real. It just doesn't have to keep going." She was quiet for a while. Then, "The name you gave the business, the new one." "Yes." "Did you choose it for any reason?" He thought about how to answer that. "I chose it because it was mine to choose. Nothing inherited it. Nothing political about it. No one was owed anything by it." He paused. That seemed like the right kind of name for a place that was supposed to be a different thing. She turned her head and looked at him in the last of the light. "A different thing," she said. "Yes." "Are we a different thing?" He looked back at her. The question was not romantic in the constructed way of questions designed to produce a particular answer. It was the honest question of a person who has been rebuilt from evidence and needs to know what the current evidence shows. The same measuring attention she'd trained on him at the altar, in her room, in the warehouse, throughout the entire accelerating collapse of everything. Directed now not at threat assessment, but at something quieter and more fundamental. "I think we're becoming one," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the water and the boats coming in on the tide. And after a moment, she shifted her weight slightly on the dockboard so that her shoulder was against his, which was not a dramatic gesture, but was a real one. And they sat like that in the diminishing light without speaking, while the fishing boats found their moorings one by one, and the stars appeared above the fog line, and the water went dark and continued its steady work of moving against the dock. The city 2 hours south was still processing its consequences. The courts were still working through the cases. The federal investigation still had threads running through Blackwater's institutional structure, pulling things into the light that had been comfortable in the dark for decades. The people who had survived the Varelli Vale War were still living in it, or recovering from it, or counting the cost of it in the specific private accounting that people do when the public accounting is finished. None of that was resolved. These things didn't resolve cleanly. They moved forward and became the past, and the past became the ground beneath the present, and the ground was never entirely solid, but you learned its specific instabilities and you built accordingly. Here, on the North Coast, in the evenings when the boats came in, it was possible to exist at a sufficient distance from the unresolved to find out what was present in the space that the violence had occupied. What was present, Kael had found, was quieter than he'd expected, and more difficult and more worthwhile. What was present, Seraphine was still discovering, because discovery at the pace she'd been given it required a long time and a place where the next thing didn't come crashing in before the current one was understood. The dock held them both. The tide moved in the dark below. The lights of the boats were small and steady and went on burning long after everything else had gone dark, which was not a metaphor for anything but was simply what running lights did. Kept burning, kept marking position, kept saying, here, still moving, still above the water, still here. That was enough. For tonight, that was entirely enough.